Imagine a world where the fate of entire civilizations didn't always rest on the edge of a sword, but sometimes on the delicate stroke of a pen. Picture ancient rulers gathering not on battlefields, but in palace chambers, sealing agreements with wax seals and sacred oaths, believing they had secured peace for generations to come. These treaties were monumental achievements in their time, celebrated with feasts, inscribed on silver tablets, and sworn before gods. Yet today, most of these agreements have vanished from memory, their dissolution so quiet that history barely recorded their passing. What happened to these solemn promises that once held empires together? How could something so carefully negotiated simply evaporate into the whispers of time? We're about to embark on a remarkable journey through 25 forgotten ancient treaties that fell apart, not with dramatic explosions of conflict, but with barely audible sighs. These weren't failures of battle, they were failures of diplomacy, of human nature, of trust stretched too thin across cultures and centuries. From the sun-baked valleys of Mesopotamia to the Forum of ancient Rome, these agreements represent humanity's earliest attempts to create order through words rather than weapons. Each treaty tells a story of hope against the relentless tide of ambition, misunderstanding, and the simple passage of time that renders even the most sacred vows obsolete. By exploring these silent failures, we're not just uncovering lost history, we're discovering something fundamental about ourselves and our continued struggle to maintain peace in a complex world. These ancient whispers hold powerful lessons about what makes agreements last, why they fail, and how the delicate balance of power and promise has shaped human civilization from its earliest days to our present moment. So settle in and prepare to discover how the quietest endings often speak the loudest truths about our shared past and our collective future. Long before the concept of international law existed, ancient empires crafted agreements that functioned as the delicate scaffolding of their known world. This was an era where diplomacy moved at the speed of a sailing ship or a marching caravan, where envoys carried the weight of kingdoms in their spoken words and sealed scrolls. The process itself was a profound blend of the sacred and the strategic. Rivals didn't merely sign documents, they swore binding oaths to their gods, invoking divine retribution upon themselves and their descendants should they break their word. Elaborate ceremonies accompanied these signings, featuring grand feasts, the exchange of priceless gifts, and rituals designed to create a personal bond between rulers who might never even meet face to face. A treaty was more than a political tool, it was a sacred covenant, yet for all this ceremony, these agreements rested on incredibly fragile foundations. The entire system operated on a framework of personal honor and religious fear, with no supranational body or international court to adjudicate disputes. If one party violated the terms, the only recourse was often a return to warfare. This lack of an enforcement mechanism was a critical weakness. Furthermore, the stability of a treaty was almost entirely dependent on the individuals who made it. The death of a king could instantly void decades of careful negotiation, as his successor might feel no obligation to honor promises they didn't make. Power dynamics were in constant flux. A famine, a revolt in a distant province, or the sudden rise of a new external threat could shatter the delicate balance of power that made the agreement viable in the first place. Cultural and linguistic differences added another layer of fragility. A term that seemed clear to an Egyptian scribe might hold a completely different connotation for a Hittite translator. Concepts of borders, sovereignty, and even friendship were not universal constants, but were deeply shaped by individual worldviews. A promise of mutual defense could be interpreted as immediate military aid by one empire and as a vague, long-term intention by the other. These misunderstandings, often buried in the subtext of the agreement, would fester over time, leading to accusations of bad faith and ultimately collapse. Perhaps the most defining feature of these ancient diplomatic failures is their silence. The end of a war is marked by a decisive battle, a conquered capital, a clear victor and vanquished. But the end of a treaty that often left no monument, it simply ceased to be observed. The flow of gifts would stop, envoys were no longer received. The once sacred words inscribed on clay or papyrus were gradually covered by dust, then by sand, and finally by oblivion. Later historians, often writing for the victors, had little interest in documenting the nuanced failure of a peace pact when they could instead glorify a military triumph. This is why so many of these treaties dissolved with a whisper. Their ends were quietly edited out of the historical record, leaving us to piece together their stories from fragments and echoes. Understanding this inherent fragility is essential because it reveals that the collapse of these agreements was rarely a simple matter of betrayal. It was usually the inevitable outcome of a world trying to impose order on chaos with nothing but words and wishes. If we think of these ancient treaties as delicate structures built to bridge the gap between competing powers, then understanding why they crumbled requires us to examine the flawed materials and unstable ground on which they were constructed. The most common cause of failure wasn't a single cataclysmic event, but a slow, silent accumulation of stresses and fractures. Ambiguity in terms was a primary weakness. Unlike modern legal documents drafted by teams of lawyers parsing every clause, ancient agreements often relied on broad statements of intent. A promise to provide military aid or respect territorial waters could be interpreted in wildly different ways by each party. This vagueness was sometimes intentional, a diplomatic fudge to get two stubborn rulers to put their names on the same parchment, but it planted a seed of future conflict that would eventually grow and split the agreement apart. The element of time itself was another silent treaty killer. These pacts were often created to address the immediate circumstances of a specific conflict or political moment. But empires change, economies shift, and new threats emerge from beyond the horizon. A treaty designed to manage the balance of power between two nations could become utterly irrelevant if a third, more powerful empire rose nearby, rendering the original agreement a historical curiosity. The world would move on, and the parchment, once so vital, would simply cease to matter, its expiration so gradual that nobody even noticed the exact moment it became obsolete. Perhaps the most personal and unpredictable factor was the human element. In an age where rule was absolute, a treaty was less an agreement between states and more a personal pledge between two rulers. Their bond, sealed through oaths, marriages, or exchanges of gifts, was the treaty. This created a fatal flaw. The death of a king could void decades of careful diplomacy in an instant. A successor, especially one who had risen through rebellion or assassination, frequently felt no obligation to honor the promises of their predecessor. Those commitments weren't just politically inconvenient. They could be seen as a legacy of weakness from a regime they had overthrown. The sacred oaths sworn to a foreign god held no power over a new ruler who worshipped a different pantheon entirely. The entire agreement could vanish overnight, not with a declaration of war, but with the quiet passing of a single man. Beneath the surface of even the most celebratory negotiations often lay deep wells of mutual distrust. The very act of making a treaty was an admission that the other party was a threat powerful enough to require placation. This underlying tension rarely disappeared. It was merely papered over with elegant language. Both sides would often leave the negotiating table already looking for advantages, interpreting clauses in their favor, and preparing for the eventual breakdown they believed was inevitable. The treaty became a temporary ceasefire, a chance to regroup and rearm, rather than a genuine foundation for lasting peace. Its dissolution, therefore, wasn't a surprise, but the expected outcome of a relationship built not on trust, but on a mutually acknowledged and deeply rooted suspicion that no amount of words could ever truly erase. Our journey into these forgotten agreements begins with what is arguably the most famous ancient treaty of them all, yet its ultimate fate was one of silent irrelevance. The peace pact between the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III, forged around 1259 before the Common Era, stands as a masterpiece of Bronze Age diplomacy. This wasn't some vague declaration of friendship. It was a detailed, sophisticated document born from the exhausting stalemate following the colossal Battle of Kaddish. The two superpowers of the age had bled each other white, and both rulers saw the profound wisdom in turning conflict into cooperation. The treaty they crafted was remarkably modern in its complexity. It contained specific clauses for mutual defense, pledging that if a third party attacked either empire, the other would come to its aid with military force. It established clear procedures for the extradition of political fugitives, ensuring rebels couldn't find safe haven across the border. It even formalized a dynastic marriage, with Ramesses II wed to a Hittite princess to seal the bond between the royal houses, transforming the relationship from one of mere tolerance into one of symbolic kinship. The ceremony surrounding this pact was designed to be unforgettable, its terms inscribed not on perishable papyrus but on durable silver tablets, a testament to its perceived permanence. It was celebrated with great pomp in both the Egyptian capital of Ramesses and the Hittite capital of Hattusa. For a time, it worked beautifully. The peace held, trade flourished along the routes between the two empires, and an unprecedented era of stability settled over the region. This was the high watermark of diplomatic achievement, a shining example of what could be accomplished through negotiation instead of conquest. But the treaty's strength was also its greatest vulnerability. It was an agreement between two specific empires, entirely dependent on their continued existence and power. Within a generation, the entire foundation of the pact crumbled into dust. The Hittite Empire, beset by a perfect storm of internal rebellions, famine, and the massive, mysterious invasion of the so-called Sea Peoples, collapsed completely. Their grand capital, Hattusa, was abandoned and burned. Almost overnight, one of the two signatories to this celebrated treaty simply vanished from the world stage. And so, the agreement didn't end with a dramatic rupture or a new declaration of war. There was no one left for Egypt to betray or to complain to. The treaty simply ceased to matter. It became a document without a counterpart, a promise made to a ghost. The magnificent silver tablets, once so central to international affairs, were likely melted down for their precious metal or stored away in some forgotten archive. Later Egyptian records, written just a few decades after the treaty was signed, scarcely mention the Hittites at all, as if their mighty empire and its great king had been little more than a fleeting dream. The most profound piece of its age was erased not by malice, but by the silent, inexorable tides of history, a powerful reminder that even the most solemn vows are powerless against the fall of civilizations. But the grand peace between Egypt and the Hatti was not the first attempt to settle the score at Kaddish. Years earlier, another agreement was reached in the dusty aftermath of that very same battle, an accord so flawed and fragile that it was practically doomed from the moment it was conceived. This is the story of the forgotten Treaty of Kaddish, a precursor to the more famous Pact, and a masterclass in how not to draft an international agreement. The battle itself was a monumental clash, a chaotic melee of thousands of chariots where both Pharaoh Ramesses II and King Muwatalli II of the Hittites could rightfully claim to have avoided a catastrophic defeat. This mutual survival created a stalemate, and a stalemate demands a negotiated settlement. The two sides, exhausted and bled dry, came to the table with one primary goal: to get something down on papyrus that would allow their armies to go home. The resulting treaty was a product of this exhaustion, a rushed document designed for immediate face-saving rather than long-term stability. Its most critical failure lay in its breathtaking ambiguity, particularly concerning the borders between the two empires. The region of Amurru, a strategically vital coastal territory in modern-day Syria, was the central point of contention. The treaty's language regarding its status was deliberately vague, allowing both Ramesses and Muwatalli to return to their capitals and proclaim to their people that they had secured this prized land. The Egyptians could point to clauses that suggested Hittite influence would recede, while the Hittites could interpret other sections as a confirmation of their continued sovereignty. This wasn't a meeting of minds, it was a diplomatic fiction, an agreement to use ambiguous language and disagree about what it meant later. They had not created peace, they had merely institutionalized the dispute. Unsurprisingly, this lack of clarity made the treaty utterly unenforceable. With no neutral third party to interpret the terms and no mechanism for arbitration, every minor incident along the blurred border escalated into a crisis. A Hittite garrison refusing to withdraw from a fort, a clear violation. An Egyptian-backed local chieftain raising taxes on trade caravans, an act of aggression. For years after the celebratory feasts ended, a low-intensity conflict simmered along the frontier. Skirmishes between border patrols, raids on outposts, and economic warfare through trade tariffs became the new normal. The Grand Treaty, intended to end all hostilities, had instead created a perpetual state of tense, unresolved conflict, proving that a bad peace is often worse than no peace at all. The ultimate fate of this flawed agreement was not a dramatic annulment but a slow fade into total obscurity. Within a generation, the wiser minds in both Egypt and the newly stabilized Hittite kingdom under Hattusili III recognized the inherent instability of this earlier accord. They saw it for what it was, a temporary and toothless ceasefire. This realization led them to negotiate the far more substantial and detailed Silver Tablet Treaty that would so famously replace it. The original Treaty of Kaddish was simply overshadowed, its failures made irrelevant by a more serious and comprehensive effort. Furthermore, the rising storm of Assyrian expansion to the east began to command the attention of both empires, presenting a common threat that made their petty border squabbles seem insignificant. The forgotten treaty wasn't formally cancelled, it was just quietly shelved, a draft agreement that was rendered null and void by the superior statecraft that followed, and the relentless march of history that made its narrow concerns obsolete. Yet even as the ink dried on the pact between Egypt and the Hittites, a very different kind of alliance was taking shape far to the west, one built not on mutual exhaustion but on pure, cold-blooded opportunism. The year was 412 before the Common Era, and the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta had reached a grueling stalemate. Both Greek powerhouses were financially drained and militarily exhausted after decades of brutal conflict. Sparta, the formidable land power, found itself utterly outmatched at sea by the Athenian navy, a weakness that threatened to prolong the war indefinitely. In their desperation, the Spartan leadership made a decision that would have been unthinkable to earlier generations. They turned to the eternal enemy of all Greeks, the colossal Persian Empire. The negotiations were a masterpiece of cynical realpolitik. The Persian satrap Tissaphernes, representing the great king Darius II, saw a golden opportunity to weaken the Greek world by helping these rivals bleed each other dry. He offered the Spartans exactly what they lacked: vast quantities of gold and silver to fund a new fleet, and access to the skilled Phoenician sailors who could challenge Athenian naval dominance. In return, Sparta was asked to pay a devastating price: formal recognition of Persian sovereignty over the Greek cities dotting the coast of Asia Minor. These were communities that for generations had fought for their independence, and whose Ionian cousins had sparked the original Greco-Persian Wars. The Spartans, in their single-minded pursuit of victory over Athens, agreed to bargain away the freedom of their own kin. From its very inception, this partnership was poisoned by a deep and abiding mutual contempt. The Spartans, proud and fiercely independent, saw the Persians as decadent barbarians, a necessary evil to be used and discarded. The Persians, viewing the Greeks as chaotic and perpetually warring tribes, saw the alliance as a cheap and efficient way to manage a troublesome frontier. Neither side had any illusion that this was a bond of friendship or shared values. It was a transaction. This foundational distrust manifested in constant squabbling. Tissaphernes, following a classic strategy of keeping his allies dependent, often delayed payment or provided just enough support to keep Sparta afloat, but never enough to let it become truly powerful. The Spartan commanders, in turn, grew increasingly frustrated and resentful, feeling they were being manipulated by a foreign power they fundamentally despised. The fragile nature of this arrangement was exposed the moment the balance of power began to shift. After a decisive Spartan naval victory at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BC, the war's outcome was all but sealed. With the Athenian fleet destroyed and their city under siege, Sparta no longer needed Persian gold to achieve victory. Almost immediately, they began to distance themselves from their erstwhile benefactors. The promises regarding the Greek cities in Asia Minor were quietly ignored or reinterpreted. The Spartans, now the undisputed hegemon of Greece, saw no reason to honor a humiliating agreement made from a position of weakness. The Persians, for their part, were not particularly outraged. Their primary goal of crippling Athenian power had been achieved spectacularly, and they could always find other ways to exert influence. There was no formal dissolution, no angry denouncement. The alliance simply atrophied, its purpose fulfilled. The flow of Persian gold stopped. The Spartan ambassadors left the Persian court, and within a few short years, it was as if the pact had never existed at all, a whispered secret of the war, a temporary marriage of convenience that neither side cared to remember once the necessity had passed. Yet, even as the Spartan-Persian alliance faded into memory, another and far more public diplomatic effort was unfolding back in the Greek heartland. An agreement so grand in its ambition and so dismal in its outcome that it stands as a textbook example of a peace that nobody truly wanted. The Peace of Nishas, signed in 421 before the Common Era, was meant to be the definitive conclusion to the first decade of brutal fighting between Athens and Sparta, a conflict that had already reshaped the Greek world. Named after the Athenian general who championed it, the treaty was a monumental achievement on parchment. It called for a cessation of hostilities that would last for 50 years, a breathtakingly optimistic time frame. It meticulously outlined a return to the pre-war status quo. Captured territories were to be exchanged, prisoners of war released, and both great powers pledged to respect each other's spheres of influence. On the surface, it was a masterwork of diplomacy, a balanced and thoughtful end to a war that had left both sides weary and financially crippled. But the treaty's most fatal flaw was not in its wording but in its scope. It was an agreement crafted by and for two exhausted giants, Athens and Sparta, with little more than a passing consideration for the complex web of alliances that had drawn them into war in the first place. The smaller city-states, the so-called minor allies who had fought alongside the major powers, found their grievances and security concerns utterly ignored. Key players like Corinth and Thebes, vital members of the Spartan-led Peloponnesian League, were deeply dissatisfied with the terms. They had entered the war with specific goals and territorial ambitions that were completely unmet by the peace. Corinth, a great trading power, saw its commercial interests sacrificed for Athenian convenience, while Thebes feared a resurgent Athens would threaten its own regional dominance. These were not minor oversights, they were gaping holes in the foundation of the entire agreement. Consequently, the ink was barely dry before the peace began to unravel at its edges. While the Athenian and Spartan armies largely stood down, their restless allies continued to skirmish, dragging the two powers into a series of proxy conflicts that violated the spirit, if not always the exact letter, of the treaty. A particularly volatile flashpoint was the city of Amphipolis, a strategically vital Athenian colony that had been captured by Sparta early in the war. The treaty stipulated its return to Athens, but the Spartan general who held it, a man named Clearidas, simply refused to give it up, and his government in Sparta proved either unable or unwilling to force his compliance. This single act of defiance became a symbol of the entire peace's impotence. Athens, in turn, used this violation as a pretext to refuse returning its own captured Spartan-held fortresses, and a debilitating cycle of accusations and counter-accusations began, with neither side making any genuine effort at arbitration or reconciliation. The result was a bizarre and tense Cold War that lasted for 6 years. There was no grand, dramatic shattering of the peace, no single event that could be pointed to as the moment it ended. Instead, the 50-year peace of Nishas simply eroded day by day through 1,000 small acts of bad faith, ignored violations, and simmering resentment. It became a hollow shell, a technical state of non-war that everyone knew was temporary. Historians still debate whether this period should even be called a peace at all, or merely a strained and unstable interlude between two acts of all-out war. Its quiet, inglorious crumble stands as an eternal lesson in the necessity of inclusive diplomacy. A peace treaty is not a document signed by two principals. It is an ecosystem that requires the consent and commitment of all involved parties. Without that complete buy-in, the most carefully crafted agreement is little more than words waiting to be undone by the whispers of discontent. While the Greek world was embroiled in its own complex web of alliances and betrayals, a far more consequential relationship was being forged across the Mediterranean Sea, one that would ultimately shape the destiny of the Western world. The story of Rome and Carthage did not begin with the legendary Punic Wars, those epic clashes of empires, but with a series of careful, pragmatic agreements struck over 2 centuries. These were not peace treaties born of exhaustion, but commercial pacts crafted by 2 rising powers cautiously circling each other, each recognizing the other's strength and seeking to define the rules of engagement before conflict could erupt. The first of these agreements, reportedly signed in 509 before the Common Era, just after the founding of the Roman Republic, was a remarkable document of its time. It was a treaty not of friendship, but of boundaries, a clear, almost cold-hearted delineation of who could go where and trade what. This initial pact, and those that followed over the next 230 years, meticulously carved up the Mediterranean world into distinct spheres of influence. Carthage, the mercantile superpower descended from Phoenician traders, demanded and received recognition of its commercial dominance in North Africa and the Western Mediterranean. Rome, at this point still a largely land-based power focused on the Italian peninsula, was restricted in where its merchant vessels could sail and trade. The treaties were incredibly specific, forbidding Romans from establishing permanent settlements in Carthaginian-controlled territories like Sardinia and Libya, and even placing limits on how far south Roman traders could go along the coast. In return, Carthage likely recognized Rome's growing influence in central Italy. These were not alliances, they were non-aggression pacts built on a foundation of mutual economic interest and a healthy dose of suspicion. For generations, this arrangement held, allowing both civilizations to grow in their own designated lanes, their relationship governed by a clear, if distant, set of rules. The fatal flaw in this long-standing arrangement was not in the wording of the treaties themselves, but in the inherent nature of the two signatories. Rome was not content to remain a regional Italian power. Its entire political and military engine was geared toward relentless, almost organic expansion. As Rome consolidated its hold over the Italian peninsula, subjugating rival cities and forging a powerful confederation, its ambitions and its economic needs grew. Roman merchants, backed by an increasingly confident Senate, began to push against the boundaries set by the old treaties. They looked with envy at the rich trade networks controlled by Carthage and started to test the limits of the agreement, venturing into gray areas and disputed zones, always probing for weakness. The Carthaginians, for their part, were deeply conservative in their foreign policy. They viewed the treaties as permanent, immutable charters that would forever lock in their privileged position. They failed to appreciate the revolutionary, dynamic nature of the Roman state, a state that saw legal agreements not as sacred, eternal vows, but as temporary arrangements subject to reinterpretation based on present circumstances. This fundamental clash of perspectives turned the treaties from instruments of peace into triggers for war. The inevitable flashpoint came in 264 before the Common Era with the crisis in Messana, a strategic city in Sicily. When a group of Italian mercenaries seized the city and found themselves threatened by the powerful Syracuse, they appealed for help to both Carthage and Rome. Carthage, seeing an opportunity to solidify its control over Sicily, sent a garrison. Rome faced an agonizing dilemma. Intervening would be a blatant violation of the long-standing treaties that recognized Carthaginian primacy in Sicily. But to do nothing would allow its newfound rival to dominate a key strategic position just off the Italian coast. After a fierce debate, the Roman Senate made a decision that would echo through history. They chose to intervene. In doing so, they did not formally declare the old treaties void. Instead, they performed a masterful act of legal reinterpretation, arguing that the new situation demanded a new response, effectively rendering the ancient agreements irrelevant through action rather than proclamation. This was the true whisper of the Romano-Carthaginian treaties' end. They were not torn up in a fit of rage or publicly renounced. There was no grand ceremony of dissolution. Their demise was a silent, gradual process of erosion. As Roman power expanded, the context in which those treaties were written simply vanished. The world of 264 BC was not the world of 509. Rome was no longer a minor power seeking to protect its coastline. It was a burgeoning empire. The old pacts, designed to manage a relationship between unequals, could not hope to contain the ambitions of two equals now destined for a colossal collision. The treaties faded away not with a dramatic rupture, but with the quiet, inexorable force of shifting power, a stark lesson that the most carefully negotiated words on parchment are powerless against the tides of history and ambition. Victory on the battlefield is one thing, but crafting a lasting peace is an entirely different challenge. a lesson Rome would learn through its first major venture into the power politics of the Hellenistic East. The Treaty of Apemia, signed in 188 before the Common Era, wasn't just the end of a war, it was a declaration of a new world order. For decades, the sprawling Seleucid Empire, ruled by the ambitious Antiochus III, had been the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, its influence stretching from the shores of modern Turkey deep into Asia. Rome, fresh from its triumph over Carthage in the Second Punic War, was now a confident Mediterranean power, and its clash with Antiochus was inevitable. The decisive Roman victory at the Battle of Magnesia sent a shockwave through the ancient world, proving that the legions of this Italian republic could defeat even the most prestigious Hellenistic army. The terms imposed at Apemia were not merely punitive, they were structurally transformative, designed to systematically dismantle the Seleucid Empire as a major military threat for generations to come. Antiochus was forced to surrender all of his territories in Asia Minor, the wealthy and strategically vital land bridge between Europe and Asia. He was ordered to hand over his entire war elephant corps and most of his navy, effectively neutering his ability to project power across the sea. But the most crushing blow was financial, a staggering war indemnity of 15,000 talents of silver to be paid in annual installments over 12 years. This was an astronomical sum, equivalent to decades of royal revenue, intended to bankrupt the Seleucid treasury and keep the kingdom economically hobbled for the foreseeable future. To ensure compliance, the Romans took a host of royal hostages, including the king's own son, the future Antiochus IV. On the surface, it was a masterstroke of diplomatic engineering, a peace so severe it would prevent any future resurgence. Yet Rome, in its calculated severity, made a critical miscalculation. The treaty treated the Seleucid Empire as a single, monolithic entity that could be weakened and then left to manage its own decline. It failed to account for the volatile, multi-ethnic nature of the kingdom, a sprawling realm held together by a fragile patchwork of loyalties, local dynasts, and rival claimants to power. The immense financial strain of the annual indemnity forced the Seleucid kings to impose harsh taxes on their already restive subjects. This economic pressure cracked the foundations of the state, fueling resentment and sparking revolts from Judea to Persia. The loss of prestige from the defeat itself was even more damaging. For a Hellenistic monarchy whose right to rule was based on an aura of invincibility and divine favor, the humiliation at Magnesia was a political catastrophe. Local governors and client kings who had once feared Antiochus now saw a weakened master, and they began to assert their own independence. Rome, perhaps unintentionally at first, began to actively encourage this fragmentation. Seeing a strong, unified Seleucid state as a potential threat, Roman diplomats increasingly involved themselves in the kingdom's internal disputes, playing rival factions against each other and offering support to breakaway regions. They didn't need to conquer the East, they could simply manage its chaos from afar, ensuring no single power could ever challenge them again. The Treaty of Apemia had handed them the perfect tool for this. The ongoing indemnity payments gave Rome a permanent pretext to interfere, to send envoys to demand their money, and while they were there, to meddle in royal succession and stoke the flames of rebellion. Within just a few decades, the magnificent empire of the Seleucids was crumbling from within. The terms of the treaty, so specific and enforceable on paper, became meaningless because the entity they were imposed upon was ceasing to exist. There was no single moment where the Treaty of Apemia was denounced or broken. Instead, it suffered a far quieter fate. It simply faded into irrelevance. As the Seleucid kingdom fractured into a collection of squabbling principalities, the Jews gaining independence in Judea, the Parthians rising in the east, dozens of city-states going their own way, there was no central authority left to honor the commitments made by Antiochus III. The Roman diplomats stopped sending demands for payment because there was no one left to send them to. The mighty pact that had redrawn the map of the ancient world didn't end with a bang, but with the silent, inexorable dissolution of the very power it was designed to contain. Its demise stands as a timeless lesson that the most victorious peace can be a poison pill, sowing the seeds of instability that guarantee its own eventual collapse. Meanwhile, on the other side of the known world, a very different kind of diplomatic encounter was taking place, one that highlights the profound power of personal relationships in ancient statecraft and the inherent fragility that comes with it. The year is 303 before the Common Era, and the map of the world is being violently redrawn in the wake of Alexander the Great's death. Two of the most formidable of his successor generals, known as the Diadochi, now faced each other across the rugged passes of the Hindu Kush. To the west stood Seleucus Nicator, a seasoned Macedonian warrior fighting to hold onto the easternmost fragments of Alexander's fractured empire. To the east stood Chandragupta Maurya, the brilliant and ambitious founder of the Mauryan Empire, who had unified the vast Indian subcontinent under his rule with an army rumored to be hundreds of thousands strong. Their confrontation was not the stuff of epic poetry, with two great armies clashing in a decisive battle. Instead, it was a moment of stark, pragmatic calculation. Seleucus, having just spent years securing his hold over Babylon and Persia, looked east and saw a powerful, unified Indian empire that would be immensely costly to conquer. Chandragupta, consolidating his own unprecedented domain, saw little advantage in pushing further into the arid and difficult territories of Afghanistan. Both men were practical rulers, not reckless conquerors. They chose the conference table over the battlefield, and the agreement they forged would become one of the most fascinating and unique treaties of the ancient world. The terms of their pact were a remarkable reflection of their respective strengths and needs. In a stunning transaction, Seleucus ceded a huge swath of territory, encompassing much of modern-day Afghanistan, Balochistan, and parts of eastern Iran, to the Mauryan Empire. This was no minor border adjustment. It was the transfer of entire satrapies, regions that had been painstakingly conquered by Alexander. In return, Chandragupta provided Seleucus with something he desperately needed to secure his own wars against his rival generals in the west, 500 war elephants. This was not a symbolic gift, it was a game-changing infusion of military hardware. These massive animals, used like living tanks, would prove decisive for Seleucus at the Battle of Ipsus just a year later, securing his place as the ruler of a massive Asian kingdom. Beyond this extraordinary exchange, the treaty also established a formal diplomatic relationship, likely sealed by a dynastic marriage, a common practice to bind two royal houses together with bonds of kinship. For decades, the pact held strong, facilitated by the personal respect between these two founding fathers of empires. The Greek historian Megasthenes even served as Seleucus's ambassador to the magnificent Mauryan court at Pataliputra, and his writings provide us with some of the most detailed Western accounts of ancient Indian society, culture, and administration. Trade flourished along the new border, with ideas, goods, and people flowing freely between the Hellenistic and Indian worlds. This was a treaty that worked, not because of rigid legal clauses, but because it served the clear and ongoing interests of the two men who made it. They had built a partnership that was mutually beneficial and personally guaranteed. But this success contained the seeds of its own quiet demise. The entire arrangement was fundamentally a personal compact between Chandragupta and Seleucus. Their bond, their mutual understanding, and their strategic needs were the glue that held it together. when they passed from the scene, that glue dissolved. Their successors inherited the thrones, but not the original context of the agreement. The Mauryan Empire, under later rulers, began to turn inward, focusing on internal consolidation and the spread of Buddhist philosophy rather than foreign expansion. The immense cost of maintaining a large standing army and administering such a vast territory may have also made the distant Afghan holding seem more like a burden than an asset. For the Seleucids, the calculus shifted even more dramatically. The successors of Seleucus found their attention perpetually drawn westward, into a never-ending series of wars against the Ptolemies of Egypt for control of Syria and Anatolia, and against the rising power of Rome. The eastern provinces, those lands traded for elephants, became a distant backwater, a frontier to be managed rather than a core territory to be defended. The personal connection to the Mauryan court faded without the exchange of ambassadors and gifts that had characterized the relationship between the founders. The dynastic marriage, if there was one, failed to produce a lasting political linkage between the two dynasties, and so the magnificent pact didn't end with a war or a formal annulment. There was no new treaty to replace it. It simply atrophied from disuse and changing priorities. The flow of diplomats slowed to a trickle and then stopped. The shared border, once a zone of vibrant exchange, became a quiet periphery. By the time the Mauryan Empire itself began to decline and fragment a century later, the agreement was already a distant memory, a historical footnote from the reign of a legendary founder. Its whisper of an ending is perhaps the purest example of a profound truth in ancient diplomacy. An agreement between two great men is only as lasting as the world they built together. When that world changes or when they leave the stage, their carefully crafted pacts can evaporate like morning mist, leaving behind little but the echo of a handshake that once shifted the balance of the world. While the great powers of the Mediterranean and India navigated the complexities of diplomacy, a far more ruthless and calculating game of strategy was unfolding in ancient China, where the very concept of a treaty was being weaponized. The era known as the Warring States period was a brutal free-for-all between 7 major powers, each vying for ultimate control of the known world. In this high-stakes environment, the Western state of Qin began to reveal itself as a predator of unparalleled cunning, and its relationship with the massive southern state of Chu became a masterclass in strategic deception. The alliance they formed in the 3rd century before the Common Era was never a pact between friends or even respectful rivals. It was, from the very beginning, a trap dressed in the finery of diplomacy. Qin's long-term ambition, later immortalized as all under heaven, was nothing less than the total conquest and unification of China. To achieve this, its rulers and their brilliant advisors, the legalist strategists, developed a coldly pragmatic foreign policy. They understood that trying to fight all their enemies at once was a recipe for disaster. Instead, they perfected a strategy of befriending the distant while attacking the near. This meant forming temporary, insincere alliances with powers on the other side of the chessboard to isolate and destroy a closer, more immediate threat. The vast and wealthy state of Chu, while powerful, was often seen as this distant friend, a useful counterbalance to the states that stood directly between Qin and its goals. The specific alliance in question was likely forged with a clear and limited objective: the mutual dismantling of smaller, vulnerable states that lay between them or on their flanks. For Chu, this must have seemed like a logical move. Qin was offering a partnership to share the spoils of conquest, allowing Chu to focus on its own rivals and secure its borders. The Chu leadership, perhaps lulled into a false sense of security by Qin's overtures and the exchange of hostages and sworn oaths, agreed to the pact. They moved their armies in concert with kins, trusting that their new ally would honor the agreed-upon division of territory. For a short time, the alliance functioned as advertised, with both powers making gains at the expense of their weaker neighbors. But every move kin made was a calculated step in a much larger game. The territories they allowed Chu to take were, in the kin's strategic view, merely being held in trust. The kin leadership, particularly under the ruthless King Zhao, viewed the alliance not as a binding agreement but as a temporary tactical pause, a chance to neutralize other threats and reposition their forces without having to worry about their southern flank. They were playing a longer, slower, and far more sinister game than their partners in Chu could possibly imagine. The trust Chu placed in the agreement was its greatest vulnerability, a weakness that kin was patiently waiting to exploit. The dissolution of this pact was a masterpiece of silent betrayal. There was no dramatic declaration of war, no public renunciation of the treaty terms. Such overt actions would have united the remaining states against kin in a panic. Instead, kin simply began to change its behavior in subtle, almost deniable ways. They might have slow-walked their promised military support for a Chu campaign, or suddenly raised objections over the ownership of a recently conquered city, citing some obscure historical claim. They began to apply relentless diplomatic and military pressure on the very territories they had just helped Chu acquire, whittling away at the edges of their allies' domain through 1,000 small cuts. This gradual erosion made it difficult for Chu to pinpoint a single, undeniable act of aggression that would justify a full-scale war. By the time the Chu court realized the true nature of kin's intentions, it was too late. Kin's military machine, honed by decades of reform and focused entirely on conquest, was now poised and ready. The temporary alliance had served its purpose. It had kept Chu complacent while kin systematically eliminated other rivals. With its back now secure, kin turned its full, terrifying attention to its former partner. The final campaigns against Chu were among the most brutal of the entire unification period, culminating in the sack of the Chu capital and the effective end of Chu as an independent power. The treaty didn't end. It was simply consumed by the relentless expansion of the state that had never intended to keep it. This quiet, methodical betrayal stands as one of history's starkest reminders that in the hands of a determined expansionist power, a treaty is not a promise, it is merely another weapon, and its breaking is often the quietest and most devastating move of all. Yet, even as the kin state perfected its strategy of long-term betrayal in the East, a very different kind of diplomatic short-termism was playing out in the West, where a rising Rome was learning to use treaties not as promises, but as placeholders. The Treaty of Apemia, signed in 205 before the Common Era, stands as a classic example of what happens when two warring powers, exhausted but not truly defeated, agree to a pause rather than a peace. This accord was never meant to be a lasting solution to the complex struggle between Rome and Philip V of Macedon. It was a temporary ceasefire born of mutual inconvenience, a diplomatic time-out that allowed both sides to catch their breath and prepare for the next inevitable round of conflict. The First Macedonian War itself was a messy, sprawling affair, often overshadowed by the simultaneous and colossal Second Punic War against Hannibal. For Rome, fighting Philip was a distracting sideshow, a peripheral conflict that drained precious resources needed for the existential struggle happening on Italian soil. Philip, an ambitious and opportunistic ruler, had initially allied with Hannibal, hoping to expand his influence in Illyria and across the Adriatic while Rome was at its most vulnerable. But the war had devolved into a costly stalemate of naval skirmishes and proxy fights among Greek city-states, yielding little glory or gain for either side. Both Rome and Macedon found themselves trapped in a conflict they couldn't easily win but weren't willing to lose, a perfect recipe for a hollow peace. The negotiations at Phonis were less about building a new future and more about managing a mutually embarrassing present. The terms were deliberately vague and unsatisfying. Philip was allowed to keep some of his recent territorial gains, a minor victory that allowed him to save face but hardly reflected his initial grand ambitions. Rome, for its part, secured promises that Philip would cease his attacks on Roman allies in Illyria, but received no guarantees about his future behavior. There were no massive indemnities, no surrender of territory, no dismantling of fleets, none of the harsh, transformative clauses that typically marked a decisive Roman victory. It was a draw formalized on parchment. Both leaders could return home and claim they had achieved their objectives, but in their hearts they knew the fundamental rivalry remained entirely unresolved. The underlying tensions, Philip's hunger for expansion and Rome's growing intolerance for any rival power in the Mediterranean, were not addressed. They were merely papered over with expedient language. The true nature of this fragile truce was revealed almost immediately in the behavior of both signatories. Neither Rome nor Philip treated the Treaty of Phonis as a sacred vow to be honored in good faith. Instead, they saw it for what it was, a temporary license to pursue their interests elsewhere without the bother of open warfare. Philip almost immediately turned his attention eastward, launching new campaigns in the Aegean and against the Ptolemaic Empire, actions that, while not a direct violation of the letter of the treaty, certainly violated its fragile spirit. He was regrouping, rebuilding, and searching for new sources of power and prestige. Rome, having finally defeated Hannibal and secured its homeland, was now free to view the Mediterranean with a new, confident, and far more ambitious gaze. The Senate began to reassess the situation in Greece not as a peripheral nuisance, but as a critical theater for future expansion. Roman diplomats, once distracted, now listened intently to the constant stream of complaints from Greek city-states and Roman allies in the region, who reported that Philip was as aggressive and threatening as ever. These reports were not merely received, they were actively sought out and amplified, providing the perfect pretext for what Rome had already decided to do. The Treaty of Phonis was not broken with a dramatic announcement. It was simply made obsolete by a shift in Roman strategic thinking. Within a mere 2 years, Rome had found a reason, or manufactured one, to declare war again, launching the Second Macedonian War with a clear goal that the first conflict had lacked: the permanent crippling of Macedonian power. The pact itself vanished from history without a whisper. It was never referred to again by the Romans as a standard to be upheld, nor was it mourned by the Greeks as a lost opportunity for peace. It left no legacy, inspired no successors, and served as a lesson to no one because its failure was so utterly predictable. The Treaty of Phonis is a testament to the emptiness of diplomatic agreements entered into without a genuine desire for resolution. It was a stopgap measure, a pause button pressed on a conflict that neither side had the will to finish at that moment, but which both fully intended to resume the second the balance of power shifted in their favor. Its quiet, unremarkable demise reminds us that the most fleeting treaties are often those designed not to end a war, but merely to postpone it. Yet even as Rome and Macedon engaged in their temporary truce, a far more spectacular and decisive clash had just concluded in the scorching sands of the Sinai Desert, an encounter that would produce a treaty so transparently hollow it serves as the ultimate example of diplomacy as theater. The Battle of Raphia in 217 before the Common Era was the largest military engagement of the entire Hellenistic age, a colossal showdown between the two superpowers of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt under Ptolemy IV and the expansive Seleucid Empire ruled by the formidable Antiochus III. Antiochus, known as Antiochus the Great for his ambitious campaigns to restore his empire's former glory, had marched south with a massive army, intent on wresting the valuable province of Syria from Ptolemaic control. The two forces met at Raphia, and against all odds, the often underestimated Ptolemy IV achieved a stunning victory, halting the Seleucid advance in its tracks. In the aftermath of such a costly and definitive battle, one might expect the victor to impose a crushing, transformative peace. Instead, what emerged was a strangely modest and conservative agreement. Ptolemy, perhaps wary of overextending his forces or nervous about the stability of his own reign, chose not to press his advantage. Antiochus, though defeated, had escaped with the core of his army intact and his power base still secure. The treaty they signed was a model of simplicity and apparent mutual respect. Both kings formally recognized the pre-war borders, effectively returning to the status quo. They pledged a lasting peace, swore oaths of non-aggression, and promised to respect each other's sovereignty. On the surface, it was a sensible, even mature resolution to a bitter conflict, a return to normalcy sealed with handshakes and solemn vows. But the true character of this pact was revealed not in its lofty language, but in the immediate actions of the two men who signed it. Neither Ptolemy nor Antiochus had any intention of honoring their new commitments. For them, the treaty was not a foundation for peace. It was a strategic intermission, a necessary pause to regroup, rearm, and recalibrate their plans. The pledges made at Raphia were empty words designed to buy the one thing both rulers desperately needed: time. Ptolemy returned to Alexandria not to bask in the glory of a lasting peace, but to face growing internal dissent. His victory had been achieved in part by arming and training native Egyptian soldiers, a decision that would soon fuel nationalist revolts that threatened to tear his kingdom apart from within. His promise of non-aggression towards Antiochus was a lifeline, allowing him to turn his entire attention to these mounting domestic crises without fearing a second invasion. Antiochus, for his part, treated the treaty with outright contempt almost the moment the ink was dry. He saw his defeat not as a reason for peace, but as a temporary setback in his grand project of Seleucid revival. Rather than demobilizing his army, he immediately turned it east, launching a series of extensive campaigns into Asia Minor and the distant eastern satrapies. These Anabasis campaigns were not the actions of a man committed to a lasting peace with his southern neighbor. They were the maneuvers of a ruler gathering strength, resources, and prestige for the next round of conflict. The treaty with Ptolemy was a convenient fiction that secured his western flank, freeing him to pursue expansion elsewhere without worry. With direct warfare temporarily off the table, their rivalry simply mutated, shifting from open battle to a shadow war of proxies and diplomatic subversion. Both courts became hubs of intrigue, funneling money and weapons to rebel groups and dissident factions within each other's empires. Antiochus's agents likely encouraged and supported the native Egyptian revolts that plagued Ptolemy, seeking to weaken his rival from within. Ptolemaic diplomats, in turn, worked to stir up trouble among the restive cities and client kings in Antiochus's newly conquered territories, creating distractions and bleeding his resources. This Cold War conducted in the shadows made a mockery of their public vows of friendship and non-aggression. The treaty was still technically in effect. Neither king formally renounced it or marched their main armies across the agreed border. But in practice, it was being violated every single day through 1,000 acts of covert hostility. The ultimate fate of the Agreement of Raphia was not a dramatic shattering, but a slow and silent erosion into complete irrelevance. The pact simply faded away because the world it was designed to govern ceased to exist. Both of these massive Hellenistic empires, for all their power and grandeur, were already entering long periods of irreversible decline, consumed by internal weakness and the relentless pressure of new rising powers, most notably Rome. Ptolemy IV's reign was followed by a series of child kings and regencies, plunging Egypt into a half-century of internal chaos from which it would never fully recover. Antiochus the Great, after his eastern successes, would eventually turn his attention back west, only to meet a catastrophic defeat at the hands of Rome at the Battle of Magnesia, an event that would permanently break Seleucid power. Their treaty died not with a bang, but with the quiet sigh of two empires turning inward, buckling under their own weight. There was no need for a formal annulment because the two signatories became too weak and too preoccupied to even bother continuing their shadow war. The Agreement of Raphia stands as a timeless lesson in the emptiness of diplomatic promises when they are not underpinned by genuine mutual interest or a shared desire for peace. It shows us that sometimes the most solemn oaths are merely tactical lies written on parchment, a temporary disguise for rivalries so deep and enduring that they can only ever be paused, never truly resolved. But even as Rome was learning to betray its distant rivals, its very first experiment in long-term partnership was unfolding much closer to home, setting a pattern that would define its foreign policy for centuries to come. In the turbulent early years of the Roman Republic, just decades after the kings had been expelled, the fledgling city-state found itself surrounded by hostile neighbors and on the brink of collapse. It was in this moment of profound vulnerability that Roman diplomats approached the Latin League, a confederation of roughly 30 city-states in the surrounding region of Latium, to propose a revolutionary idea, a permanent alliance of equals. The resulting agreement, known as the Fodesekwam or the Cassion Treaty, signed in 493 before the Common Era, was a breathtaking act of foresight and humility from a people who would later become synonymous with arrogant domination. The treaty itself was a remarkably generous and forward-thinking document for its time. It wasn't a victor's peace imposed after a conquest. It was a mutual defense pact crafted between peers. The core principle was clear and compelling. If any one of the signatory states was attacked by an outside power, all the others would immediately come to its aid with their full military force. This created a powerful deterrent against the common enemies pressing in on them from the hills, particularly the fierce mountain tribes like the Equi and the Volsci. But the Fodesekwam went far beyond mere military cooperation. It established a shared legal framework, granting citizens of any Latin city certain rights to conduct business, own property, and even marry citizens of any other signatory state, including Rome. This created an early version of a common market and a shared identity that transcended individual city walls. Most strikingly, the treaty stipulated that any spoils of war from their joint campaigns would be divided equally among all the partners. For nearly a century, this pact functioned as intended, transforming a collection of squabbling towns into a formidable coalition that secured the entire region and allowed Latin culture to flourish. The slow, silent unraveling of this partnership began not with a dramatic betrayal, but with a subtle and inexorable shift in the balance of power. Rome's unique political and military structure, its relentless drive for expansion, and its strategic location began to give it a decisive advantage over its Latin allies. While the Latin League remained a loose confederation of independent states, Rome was a single, unified, and increasingly aggressive republic. When they went to war together, it was the Roman Senate that often took the lead in planning, and the Roman consuls who commanded the combined armies. The glory and the largest share of the plunder, even if divided equally, increasingly flowed back to Rome, making it richer and more powerful with every successful campaign. The other Latin cities, by contrast, found themselves providing soldiers and resources for wars that primarily served to enhance Roman prestige and territory. The original spirit of equal partnership began to strain under the weight of Rome's growing ambition. This tension finally erupted in the Great Latin War of 340 to 338 before the Common Era, a conflict that was essentially a massive rebellion by the Latin League against Roman dominance. The Latin cities were no longer willing to be junior partners in an alliance they felt was now being run entirely for Rome's benefit. They demanded a true restoration of the original equality promised by the Cassan Treaty. The result was a brutal and decisive Roman victory. The aftermath was where the true end of the old treaty occurred, not with a dramatic tearing up of the document, but with its quiet, unilateral replacement. Rome imposed a new settlement, a series of bilateral agreements with each defeated Latin city individually. This was a masterful political stroke. Instead of dealing with a unified league that could bargain collectively, Rome now faced a collection of isolated states, each bound directly to Rome itself with separate treaties that heavily favored the victor. The old mutual defense pact was gone, replaced by a clear hierarchy where the Latin cities were obliged to supply soldiers to the Roman legions without having an equal say in where or why those legions fought. The Fodesekwam didn't expire on a specific date or with a formal declaration. Its dissolution was so gradual it was almost geological. Over the next century, Rome continued to extend citizenship rights to various Latin communities, a process that seemed generous but ultimately served to dissolve their independent identities entirely into the Roman state. The very concept of a separate Latin league slowly faded from memory, its functions and its spirit absorbed by the ever-expanding Roman Republic. The treaty's passing was unmarked because, from a Roman perspective, it hadn't been broken. It had simply been evolved, upgraded, and made obsolete by progress. This quiet, almost casual erasure of a foundational partnership demonstrates a recurring theme in history, that the most enduring alliances are often not destroyed by sudden betrayal, but are gently, patiently, and silently digested by the growing power of a partner whose ambition eventually recognizes no equals. Meanwhile, as Rome solidified its control over its Italian neighbors through pacts like the Fodesekwam, it was simultaneously learning a harsh lesson about the limits of its power in the distant, volatile region of Anatolia. The Treaty of Dardanos, signed in 85 before the Common Era, stands as a masterclass in diplomatic failure, an agreement so fundamentally flawed that its collapse was virtually guaranteed from the moment the negotiators put down their pens. This pact was born from the ashes of the First Mithridatic War, a brutal and devastating conflict that pitted the Roman Republic against Mithridates VI, the fiercely ambitious and resourceful king of Pontus. Mithridates had proven to be a nightmare opponent for Rome, a man of immense cunning and ruthlessness who had successfully rallied much of Greece and Asia Minor against Roman rule, even ordering the infamous massacre of tens of thousands of Roman and Italian citizens living in the region. The war had been a costly slog for Rome, and by the time General Lucius Cornelius Sulla arrived to take command, both sides were weary and looking for a way out, if only a temporary one. The negotiations at Dardanos were less a meeting of minds and more a tense standoff between two proud commanders who deeply distrusted one another. Sulla, though victorious in several key battles, was acutely aware that his political position back in Rome was precarious. His enemies held power in the Senate, and he needed to conclude this Eastern war quickly so he could return to Italy and secure his own survival. Mithridates, for his part, had seen his own early victories unravel, and knew his forces were not yet ready to face Sulla's battle-hardened legions in a final, decisive confrontation. Both men needed a pause, but neither was seeking a permanent peace. The resulting treaty reflected this mutual desperation and bad faith. The terms were deceptively simple yet incredibly severe for the Pontic king. Mithridates was forced to surrender all the territories he had conquered during the war, including the wealthy Roman province of Asia. He had to hand over a fleet of 70 warships, crippling his naval power, and pay a war indemnity of 2,000 talents, a massive financial blow. In return, Sulla magnanimously allowed Mithridates to remain on his ancestral throne in Pontus, a move that would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. This was the treaty's fatal flaw. For Mithridates, retaining his core kingdom and his title was not a humiliation. It was a strategic victory. He had lost a battle, but he had preserved his power base, his army, and most importantly, his life and his freedom to rule. The surrendered territories were recent acquisitions he could hope to reclaim later. The ships could be rebuilt. The indemnity, though steep, was a price worth paying to live and fight another day. From the moment he swore the oath at Dardanos, Mithridates had every intention of breaking it. He viewed the treaty not as a binding agreement, but as a necessary and temporary retreat. He returned to Pontus and immediately began a methodical and massive rebuilding program, constructing new shipyards, recruiting and training new armies, and forging new alliances with other powers who feared Rome's growing influence. He was not hiding his activities. He was preparing for the next war in plain sight, confident that Rome's internal distractions would grant him the time he needed. And for a while, he was right. Rome's response to these blatant violations was a study in negligent arrogance. The Roman Senate, consumed by the escalating civil war between Sulla and his rivals, simply ignored the gathering storm in the east. Reports from provincial governors about Mithridates' rearmament were dismissed or lost in the bureaucratic chaos. There was no mechanism, and more importantly, no political will to enforce the terms of the Treaty of Dardanos. The Romans operated under the arrogant assumption that their defeated foe would remain cowed and compliant, that the mere memory of Sulla's legions would be enough to keep him in line. They failed to understand that for a ruler like Mithridates, defeat was merely a lesson, and a treaty was just a piece of parchment to be discarded once its usefulness had expired. The Pact of Dardanos didn't shatter in a single dramatic moment. It simply molded in some forgotten archive, while the man it was designed to contain grew stronger by the day. Within just a few years, the inevitable happened. Emboldened by Rome's apparent weakness and his own renewed strength, Mithridates found a pretext to strike again, triggering the Second Mithridatic War. The Treaty of Dardanos was not formally renounced. It was simply made irrelevant by a new reality that Rome's short-sighted diplomacy had helped to create. The quiet failure of this agreement offers a timeless lesson in the dangers of crafting a peace that one side has no intention of keeping and the other has no plan to enforce. It demonstrates that the most dangerous terms are not necessarily the harshest ones, but those that are utterly unrealistic, failing to address the fundamental ambitions and grievances that started the conflict in the first place. A treaty that allows a determined and resourceful enemy to survive, regroup, and prepare for revenge is not a peace, it is merely an intermission. And yet, for all the drama of its failure, the Treaty of Dardanos at least left an undeniable mark on the historical record, a verifiable agreement whose terms we can still read about today. This stands in stark contrast to our next subject, a treaty so enigmatic that its very existence has been a matter of fierce scholarly debate for centuries. We now turn to the most ghostly pact of them all, the purported Peace of Callias. This alleged agreement, said to have been negotiated around 449 before the Common Era, represents the ultimate diplomatic whisper, a treaty that may have been stillborn, fading from history before it ever truly took root, leaving behind little more than a tantalizing question mark. The backdrop for this mystery is the epic, decades-long struggle between the Greek city-states and the colossal Persian Empire, a series of conflicts that defined an age. After the legendary Greek victories at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea had repelled the Persian invasions, the war entered a new phase. Athens, having taken the lead in forming the Delian League, a defensive alliance of Greek states, shifted from defending its homeland to going on the offensive, launching audacious campaigns to liberate Greek cities still under Persian control in Asia Minor and the Aegean Islands. The conflict became a grinding war of attrition, with neither side able to deliver a final, knockout blow. It was into this stalemate that the Athenian statesman Callias supposedly stepped, journeying to the magnificent Persian court to negotiate a formal end to hostilities on behalf of Athens and its allies. The terms attributed to this peace are what make it so compelling, if it indeed existed. According to later Greek historians, the agreement was remarkably favorable to the Greeks. It allegedly recognized the independence of the Greek cities in Ionia, a massive concession from the Persian king, who had long considered them his subjects. It established a sort of demilitarized zone in the Aegean Sea, forbidding Persian warships from sailing west of a certain line and Athenian warships from approaching the eastern Mediterranean coast of Persia. The great king, it was said, agreed to respect the autonomy of the Greek states, effectively ending his dream of conquering them. For Athens, this would have been the crowning achievement of its golden age, a formal, negotiated peace that ratified its victory and secured its empire. It was the kind of diplomatic triumph that a state would surely have inscribed on stone for all eternity, celebrating for generations. But herein lies the core of the mystery. There is no contemporary evidence for it. Not a single shred. In the writings of the great historians Herodotus and Thucydides, who lived through these events and documented them in meticulous detail, there is no mention of a formal peace of Callias. The first references to it appear decades, and in some cases more than a century, after it was supposed to have happened, in the works of orators and philosophers like Isocrates and Plato, who may have been referring to a tradition or even inventing it for rhetorical effect. There is no surviving inscription, no treaty text, no official record of its ratification. For an event of such supposed magnitude, its absence from the historical record is deafening. This has led many modern historians to conclude that the Peace of Callias is a later invention, a piece of patriotic propaganda crafted by 4th century Athenians to glorify their past and justify their ongoing claims to leadership. If the treaty did exist, even as a short-lived understanding, its quiet demise is easily explained by the relentless reality of geopolitics. The fundamental tension between an expansionist Athenian empire and a vengeful Persian superpower was simply too great to be contained by a piece of parchment. Both sides continued to see the other as their primary antagonist and the Aegean as their rightful sphere of influence. Almost immediately, they returned to their favorite pastime, meddling in each other's affairs. Persian gold, a powerful weapon, began flowing covertly to any Greek state or faction that opposed Athenian dominance, fueling rebellions and sowing discord within the Delian League. Athens, in turn, continued to support rebel satraps and dissident groups within the vast Persian Empire, probing for weaknesses and seeking to destabilize the great king's rule. This shadow war, conducted through proxies and bribes, made a mockery of any official promises of non-aggression. The treaty, if it was ever signed, didn't end with a formal renunciation or a new declaration of war. It was simply suffocated by the quiet, daily reality of mutual hostility and espionage, its terms ignored by both sides almost as soon as the ink was dry. It faded away because it never truly governed the actions of the states that supposedly agreed to it, becoming a phantom agreement, a diplomatic fiction that left no trace because it had no real substance to begin with. But if the Peace of Callias represents a treaty that may have never truly been, our next subject is one whose terms were brutally clear, yet its aftermath reveals how easily clear terms can be twisted by raw ambition. The Treaty of Lutatius, signed in 241 before the Common Era, officially ended the First Punic War, a grueling 23-year struggle between Rome and Carthage that had stretched the resources of both powers to their absolute limit. This was not a negotiation between equals, but a settlement imposed by a victor who, while exhausted, knew it held the upper hand. The Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca had fought a brilliant defensive campaign in Sicily, but with the Roman navy finally achieving dominance and cutting off his supplies, he found himself in an untenable position. Back in Carthage, the merchant aristocracy that ruled the city was weary of the war's astronomical cost and eager to return to the peaceful pursuit of commerce. They sent envoys to the Roman commander Gaius Lutatius Catullus to sue for peace. The terms Catullus presented were severe, yet they stopped short of being utterly catastrophic for Carthage. The core demands were straightforward. Carthage must evacuate all of Sicily, forever relinquishing its centuries-old foothold on the island. They were to return all Roman prisoners of war without ransom, while paying a hefty ransom for their own captured soldiers. Most significantly, they were saddled with a massive war indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver to be paid in installments over 10 years. For Carthage, these terms were painful but acceptable. Losing Sicily was a blow to pride and power, but their true wealth and strength lay in their vast trading networks across the Mediterranean and their rich North African homeland, which remained untouched. The financial reparations, while staggering, were a calculable business expense to end a conflict that was bleeding them dry. They agreed, believing they had secured a peace that, while unfavorable, would allow them to recover, rebuild, and live to fight another day. This calculation proved to be a profound misreading of the Roman character. The Roman Senate, upon reviewing the terms negotiated by Catullus, made a crucial and telling alteration. They refused to ratify the agreement until the indemnity was increased to 3,200 talents payable over just 20 years, and the clause regarding the return of prisoners was made even more lopsided in Rome's favor. This was the first signal that for Rome, the treaty was not a final settlement, but a starting point. The war had transformed Rome from an Italian land power into a confident Mediterranean naval force with a taste for empire and, crucially, an understanding of Carthage's vulnerabilities. The ink was barely dry on the revised agreement when a new crisis presented Rome with an opportunity to demonstrate its new, more aggressive interpretation of peace. The flashpoint emerged from Carthage's own weakness. The end of the war did not bring stability to Carthage. Instead, it triggered a massive and bloody rebellion by its own unpaid mercenary army, joined by oppressed Libyan subjects. This mercenary war was a desperate struggle for survival that pushed Carthage to the brink of annihilation. In the midst of this chaos, the island of Sardinia, which had been held by Carthage, also revolted. The Carthaginian garrison was expelled, and the rebels found themselves struggling to control the island. Seeing their former rival drowning in internal strife, the Roman Senate made a move of breathtaking opportunism. They asserted that Carthage's troubles on Sardinia represented a threat to regional stability, and in a stunning act of bad faith, declared that Carthaginian attempts to reconquer the island were a violation of the spirit of the Treaty of Lutatius, a treaty that said absolutely nothing about Sardinia. Carthage, fighting for its very life against the mercenaries, was in no position to argue. When Roman ambassadors arrived with what amounted to an ultimatum, the Carthaginian government was forced to swallow an even more bitter pill. Not only did they have to formally surrender Sardinia, but Rome also demanded an additional indemnity of 1,200 talents. It was a blatant act of extortion, a land grab justified by the thinnest of pretexts. The Romans had discovered a new and powerful diplomatic tool. They could use the mere existence of a treaty not as a shield for peace, but as a sword for further expansion. Any action by a weakened Carthage could be reinterpreted as a provocation, any sign of recovery seen as a threat to be neutralized through further demands. The true dissolution of the Treaty of Lutatius, therefore, was not a single event but a process. The pact was not formally broken, it was instead perverted, its original purpose twisted to serve Roman ambitions it was never designed to contain. The seizure of Sardinia, and soon after Corsica, demonstrated that Rome now viewed the treaty not as a balanced agreement but as a license for its own continued expansion. The peace became a one-sided affair, a framework that bound Carthage while placing no real constraints on Rome. This silent, cynical reshaping of the agreement's meaning would set a tragic precedent, fueling the deep-seated Carthaginian resentment that Hannibal Barca would later harness to unleash the even more devastating Second Punic War. The whisper of the treaty's end was the sound of a victor learning that a signed peace could be just another weapon, and that the terms of an agreement matter far less than the will to enforce them. The clash at the Hydaspes River was not merely a battle. It was a collision of two vastly different worlds, a brutal test of will between a god-king from the west and a titan from the east. King Porus of the Porava kingdom stood his ground, a defiant giant upon his war elephant, commanding an army that met Alexander the Great's legendary Macedonian phalanx with terrifying resolve. The fighting was fierce, a chaotic struggle in monsoon-swollen waters and muddy riverbanks, but Alexander's tactical genius ultimately prevailed. When the dust settled, the victorious conqueror faced a defeated but unbowed king. According to the famous tale, Alexander asked Porus how he wished to be treated. Porus, with magnificent pride, replied, "As one king treats another." This moment of respect between warriors transcended the simple dynamics of victor and vanquished. Instead of executing Porus or dragging him in chains, Alexander made a startling decision. He not only spared the Indian king's life but restored him to his throne, even granting him additional territories to rule as a satrap, a vassal governor within Alexander's burgeoning empire. This accord was a masterpiece of personal diplomacy, a pact built not on legalistic clauses but on the raw currency of mutual admiration and perceived honor. Alexander, ever the visionary, saw in Porus not just a defeated enemy, but a key to stabilizing his eastern frontier and a worthy ally whose loyalty, once earned, would be unshakable. For Porus, the arrangement offered a path to retain his dignity, his power, and his people's way of life under the umbrella of a seemingly invincible superpower. The bond was sealed with personal guarantees and the implicit understanding that Alexander's word was his bond. It was a handshake agreement between two titans, and for a brief, brilliant moment, it worked. Porus became one of Alexander's most reliable and powerful allies, his cavalry forming a crucial part of the Macedonian army as it pushed further into the Indian subcontinent, a living symbol of Alexander's policy of integrating foreign elites into his imperial project. Yet the immense strength of this agreement was also its only source of weakness. The entire arrangement was a personal covenant, a delicate spiderweb of loyalty connecting two specific individuals. Its authority did not derive from institutions, legal precedents, or even the will of the Macedonian state. It flowed entirely from the charismatic authority and overwhelming presence of Alexander himself. The moment that presence was removed, the web tore apart. When Alexander died unexpectedly in Babylon just 2 years later, his entire colossal empire, held together by little more than the force of his will and the loyalty of his soldiers, instantly erupted into a chaotic free-for-all. His generals, the Diadochi, turned on each other, each scrambling to carve out their own personal kingdom from the carcass of Alexander's conquests. In this mad scramble for power, a personal understanding made with an Indian king on a distant riverbank held absolutely no weight. The accord between Alexander and Porus didn't end with a formal annulment or a new declaration of war. It suffered a far quieter and more final fate. It was simply forgotten. The new powers that emerged from the fragmentation of the empire, the Seleucids in the east, had no memory of or investment in Alexander's personal promise to Porus. Their focus was on securing their own borders and managing threats closer to home. The connection between the Hellenistic world and India, so personally fostered by Alexander, withered away. Porus himself likely continued to rule his kingdom, but now as an independent monarch once more, his pact with the West becoming a local legend rather than a living, breathing political reality. Its dissolution was so complete that within a generation, it was as if the meeting of the two great kings had never happened at all. This silent end stands as one of history's most powerful lessons on the limits of charismatic leadership. It demonstrates that while a towering individual can forge bonds across cultures through sheer force of personality, such bonds are terrifyingly fragile. Without systems, structures, or shared institutions to sustain them, the most powerful personal agreements dissolve into whispers, leaving no more trace than a handshake in the wind. Yet even as Rome solidified its grip on the Western Mediterranean, a shadow was falling over the east, where three aging empires, Macedon, Seleucia, and Ptolemaic Egypt, were locked in a precarious dance of power. By 203 before the Common Era, the once mighty Ptolemaic kingdom was teetering on the brink of implosion. The boy King Ptolemy V Philopator sat on the throne, a mere child surrounded by conniving regents and a court riven by intrigue. The kingdom's armies were demoralized, its treasury was empty, and rebellions were flaring up from the Nile Delta to the southern frontier. To the ambitious rulers on its borders, this internal collapse was not a tragedy, it was an invitation. Philip V of Macedon, a ruler known for his sharp mind and sharper opportunism, and Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, fresh from his triumphant eastern campaigns and now styling himself the Great, saw the same tantalizing opportunity. A weakened Egypt, rich in grain, gold, and strategic ports, was a prize too vast to ignore. It was in this volatile atmosphere that one of antiquity's most audacious and secret diplomatic plots was hatched. We know it as the Treaty of Apemia, named not for a grand signing ceremony, but for the shadowy location, or perhaps the clandestine nature of its negotiation. This was no public accord announced to the world. It was a covert pact, a conspiracy at the highest levels of power. The terms were as simple as they were ruthless. Philip and Antiochus would coordinate a simultaneous two-front assault on the vulnerable Ptolemaic realm. They would act as partners in predation, carving up the spoils between them like butchers dividing a carcass. Philip, with his powerful navy and bases in the Aegean, would sweep south, seizing the Ptolemaic-held islands and territories in the Aegean Sea and along the coast of Asia Minor. Antiochus, with his massive land army, would drive west and south, annexing the wealthy Ptolemaic provinces in Syria and Palestine. The agreement promised to redraw the map of the eastern Mediterranean in a single, swift campaign, creating a new balance of power dominated by the two conspirators. It was a bold, cynical, and potentially brilliant plan, but the Treaty of Apemia suffered from a fatal flaw that plagues all secret alliances. It existed in a world that refused to stand still. The very act of coordinating such a massive, joint invasion created ripples that could not be contained. As Philip began his naval campaign, his fleet's aggressive movements through the Aegean sent shockwaves through the intricate network of Greek city-states and minor kingdoms. These states, many of which were nominally independent but deeply fearful of Macedonian expansion, had long relied on a delicate balance of power for their survival. The sight of Philip's warships bearing down on islands that had been under Ptolemaic protection was a clear signal that the old order was shattering. Desperate, they did what weaker powers have always done when faced with an overwhelming threat. They appealed to a stronger outside power for help. Their eyes turned west to the rising Italian Republic that had already proven its willingness to intervene in Greek affairs. Envoys from the embattled states, particularly from the island of Rhodes and the Attalid kingdom of Pergamon, raced to Rome with a dire warning. They presented the Roman Senate with a chilling portrait of a secret pact between Philip and Antiochus, painting it not merely as a war against Egypt, but as the first step in a plan to dominate the entire Mediterranean. They argued that once these two ambitious kings had digested the wealth and resources of the Ptolemaic Empire, their combined power would be unstoppable, and Rome would inevitably face a united Eastern front. This was a masterstroke of diplomatic persuasion, playing perfectly on Rome's growing paranoia about any potential rival power bloc. The Senate, which had just concluded the existential struggle of the Second Punic War, was in no mood to tolerate the rise of a new threat. They decided to intervene, not with legions at first, but with the formidable power of Roman diplomacy. A Roman embassy, led by the formidable Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, was dispatched on a dramatic tour of the Eastern courts. Lepidus's mission was not to beg or negotiate, it was to deliver ultimatums. He first confronted Philip in Macedon, then journeyed to meet Antiochus, who was already on the march in Syria. The message was identical and brutally clear. Rome was aware of their secret agreement, and Rome forbade it. They were to immediately cease their attacks on Ptolemaic territory and withdraw their forces. The subtext was unmistakable: defy us, and you will face the full military might of the Roman Republic. This direct confrontation from a distant but fearsome power changed everything. The secret was out. The Treaty of Apemia, which had derived all its power from its covert nature, was suddenly exposed to the harsh light of day and the overwhelming pressure of Roman interest. Faced with this unexpected and unified opposition, the bond between the two conspirators proved to be as fragile as glass. The treaty was, after all, a marriage of convenience, not an alliance of shared ideals or deep trust. Both Philip and Antiochus were supreme opportunists, and when the cost of their opportunity suddenly skyrocketed, they recalculated. Neither was willing to risk a catastrophic war with Rome for the sake of a partnership they had only just formed. Without a word of consultation or a shred of ceremony, they both abandoned the plan. Philip turned his attention elsewhere, and Antiochus, while he would continue to make gains in the region through more gradual means, pointedly avoided the direct, large-scale invasion the Pact had envisioned. The Treaty of Apemia simply evaporated. There was no dramatic denunciation, no formal dissolution. It was a set of promises that, once exposed to the air, oxidized into nothingness. Its failure is a timeless lesson in the inherent weakness of covert diplomacy. A secret pact can only survive as long as it remains secret. Once revealed to a powerful external force, the calculations of its signatories can change in an instant, leaving behind nothing but a whisper of what might have been. Far to the east of Rome's burgeoning empire, a fierce and deeply personal struggle for faith and freedom was raging, one that would briefly intersect with the Republic's own expanding ambitions. In the rugged hills of Judea, the Maccabean revolt was a fiery uprising against the oppressive rule of the Seleucid king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. This was no ordinary rebellion over taxes or territory. It was a cultural and religious war for the very soul of a people. Antiochus had outlawed Jewish practices, desecrated the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and forced the adoption of Hellenistic customs upon pain of death. In response, a priestly family led by Judas, called Maccabeus the Hammer, marshaled a guerrilla army, fighting not just for political independence but for the right to worship their God according to their ancient laws. Against overwhelming odds, this determined band of freedom fighters scored a series of stunning victories, reclaiming Jerusalem and rededicating the temple, an event commemorated to this day in the festival of Hanukkah. Yet for all their success, Judas Maccabeus understood a grim reality. The Seleucid Empire, though weakened by internal strife, was still a colossus. It was only a matter of time before they sent another, larger army to crush his fragile rebellion for good. Desperate for any advantage, Judas looked beyond his immediate enemies, beyond the familiar powers of the region, to a rising force whose reputation for military prowess was beginning to echo across the Mediterranean world, the Roman Republic. Sending a diplomatic mission to Rome in 161 before the Common Era was an act of both brilliant strategy and profound desperation. The envoys Judas dispatched had to travel a vast distance, a journey of months by land and sea, to reach a people whose language, culture, and political systems were utterly foreign to them. Their mission was simple yet audacious: to secure recognition and military support from the most powerful republic on earth. Their arrival in Rome would have been a minor curiosity. The Senate, accustomed to receiving delegations from sophisticated Hellenistic kingdoms, now played host to representatives of a small, priest-led rebellion from a distant mountainous province. The Jewish envoys, likely speaking through Greek translators, would have framed their struggle in terms the pragmatic Roman senators could understand. They spoke not just of religious persecution, but of a shared enemy. They highlighted the instability and weakness of the Seleucid Empire, presenting Judea as a potential foothold of loyalty and a thorn in the side of a power Rome itself was beginning to view with suspicion. They offered Rome a friendship based on a common opposition to Hellenistic monarchy, a value the Republic could publicly endorse. The Roman response was swift and, on the surface, extraordinarily generous. The Senate agreed to a formal treaty of friendship and alliance. The terms, as recorded, were remarkably favorable to the Judeans. The pact recognized the sovereignty and independence of the Jewish people under the leadership of the Maccabees. It pledged that Rome would be a friend to Judea and an enemy to its enemies. Most significantly, it included a clause warning the Seleucid king that any further aggression against Judea would be considered an unfriendly act toward Rome itself. This was a diplomatic coup of monumental proportions for Judas Maccabeus. He had secured the formal recognition of a superpower without submitting to its authority. The document was a powerful tool for legitimacy, something he could wave before his own people and, crucially, before the Seleucid enemy to deter attack. He had, it seemed, leveraged the distant reputation of Roman power to shield his nascent nation, but the gleaming promise of the Roman treaty concealed a hollow core. The alliance was a masterpiece of diplomatic theater, a declaration of intent with almost no mechanism for enforcement. Rome, at this moment in history, was deeply preoccupied with its own existential crises. The final destruction of Carthage was just over a decade away, and the Republic was simultaneously grappling with social unrest at home and other military commitments. The journey from Rome to Judea was immense, and the logistical challenge of projecting meaningful military power that far east was beyond Roman capability or interest at the time. The Senate had offered the one thing that cost it nothing, a promise. The warning to the Seleucids was a bluff, a piece of parchment whose power relied entirely on the fear of Roman intervention, a fear that was, for the moment, potent but entirely unsubstantiated by any immediate intention to act. The true test of the alliance's value came almost immediately, when the Seleucids under General Nicanor marched to finally crush the Maccabean revolt. No Roman legions appeared on the horizon. No Roman fleet blockaded Seleucid ports. No sternly worded missives from the Senate arrived to halt the invasion. Judas Maccabeus and his brothers stood alone. They met the Seleucid army at the Battle of Elossa, and there, fighting against the might of an empire, Judas was killed. The promised protection of the world's greatest republic had proven to be a phantom. The treaty did not fail in a dramatic breach of faith. It simply proved irrelevant to the brutal realities of warfare in Judea. Its terms were ignored because there was no one present to enforce them. In the years that followed, the pact faded into complete obscurity, a forgotten footnote even as the Hasmonean dynasty, founded by Judas's brothers, eventually achieved the independence he had fought for. The Romans, for their part, showed no further interest in their Judean allies until decades later, when a stronger, more confident republic began to actively meddle in the region's affairs. The quiet, unmarked death of the Romano-Judean alliance stands as a timeless lesson in the nature of long-distance diplomacy. It reveals how a great power can extend the shadow of its influence through promises alone, offering hope and legitimacy to smaller nations without ever committing a single soldier or coin to their cause. For the powerful, such agreements are cost-free instruments of soft power. For the vulnerable who believe in them, they can be a dangerous mirage, a whisper of support that vanishes at the very moment it is most desperately needed. The sting of humiliation is a powerful toxin, one that can poison even the most solemn of oaths. No story from the ancient world illustrates this truth more starkly than Rome's encounter with the Cordeen Fawkes. This was not a treaty born from negotiation or mutual respect, but one extracted under the most duress imaginable, a pact whose very origin guaranteed its silent, contemptuous demise. The year was 321 before the Common Era, and the Second Samnite War was raging across the rugged mountains of central Italy. The Roman army, confident and formidable, marched into a narrow mountain pass near Cordeen, intent on crushing the Samnite Confederation. But the Samnites, masters of the difficult terrain, had laid a perfect trap. They did not need to defeat the legions in open battle. They simply sealed both ends of the pass with formidable barricades, trapping the entire Roman force in a sunless, waterless defile. There was no escape, no path to victory. The great Roman army was utterly helpless, caught like fish in a net, facing the grim prospects of starvation or slaughter. The Samnite commander, Gaius Pontius, found himself in a curious position. He held the entire military might of his greatest rival at his mercy. His father, Hirnius, was consulted for advice, and the tale that follows is a classic lesson in realpolitik. The elder statesman reportedly presented two options: execute every single Roman soldier to permanently cripple the Republic's power, or, conversely, release them all unharmed to earn Rome's eternal gratitude and friendship. Gaius Pontius rejected both extremes, choosing a perilous middle path. He would let the Romans live, but not before subjecting them to a ritual of utter degradation designed to break their spirit forever. The terms were simple yet exquisitely humiliating. The Roman soldiers would be forced to lay down their arms, remove their armor, and clad only in a single undergarment, pass under a yoke of spears, a symbolic act of submission that marked them as defeated and enslaved. Furthermore, Rome was forced to withdraw its colonies from Samnite lands and enter into a formal treaty recognizing Samnite sovereignty. The Romans, with no other choice, agreed. They endured the walk of shame, the jeers of the Samnite soldiers, the burning humiliation searing deeper than any wound. They returned to Rome not as victorious legionaries, but as broken men, their honor stripped away along with their armor. Back within the safety of their city walls, however, the shame curdled into a cold, furious resolve. The Roman Senate, faced with the agreement their generals had signed to save the army, was plunged into a bitter debate. Some argued that a sworn oath, even one made under threat of annihilation, was sacred and binding to the gods, but the overwhelming sentiment, fueled by the public's thirst for vengeance, was that a treaty signed at sword point, without the formal rituals of the Roman state, held no legitimacy whatsoever. It was not a true foedus but a sponsio, a personal promise made by the commanders under duress, which the state was under no obligation to uphold. The pragmatists won. The Senate, with breathtaking audacity, declared the Treaty of the Cordeen Fawkes null and void. They would return the Samnite prisoners they held as a token of their technical good faith, but they would not surrender an inch of territory. The colonies stayed. The agreement was repudiated in its entirety. The Samnites were outraged but also outmaneuvered. They had won a magnificent tactical victory in the field, but they had completely misjudged the Roman character. They believed the public humiliation would force a lasting peace. Instead, it had only created an enemy more determined than ever to erase the memory of its disgrace. The treaty dissolved not with a renegotiation or a new agreement, but with a simple, silent act of defiance from Rome. There was no ceremony, no formal announcement of its end. The Romans simply stopped observing its terms and began preparing for the next phase of the war, their entire national energy focused on avenging the insult. The Samnites' great victory had bought them nothing but a brief respite and a more ferocious adversary. The war resumed with greater intensity, and within a few years, the memory of the Cordeen Fawkes was not a symbol of Samnite triumph, but a rallying cry for Roman legions who swore to never again suffer such dishonor. The Pact's quiet death teaches us that a peace built on the humiliation of a proud people is the most fragile peace of all. It may pause a conflict, but it plants the seeds for a far greater and more destructive war to come, proving that legitimacy cannot be forced. It must be mutually agreed upon, or it is nothing at all. Meanwhile, on the sun-drenched island of Sicily, a brutal and complex three-way struggle was unfolding, a microcosm of the entire Mediterranean's clashing cultures and ambitions. The great Greek city of Syracuse found itself caught in a perpetual vice, threatened from the sea by the formidable naval power of Carthage, and from within by its own fractious Greek rivals, an restive population of oppressed native Sicilians. Into this chaotic arena stepped a man who would become the prototype of the ruthless tyrant, Dionysius I. His rise to power was a masterclass in opportunistic violence and political manipulation, leveraging a crisis, a failed attack on Carthage itself, to have his rivals executed and have himself declared sole general with supreme powers. But securing his position inside the city walls was only the first step. To truly solidify his rule and turn Syracuse into a personal fortress, he needed to neutralize the existential threat looming across the water. He needed to make a deal with the devil. The pact he negotiated with Carthage in 405 before the Common Era was not a peace born of mutual respect or even mutual exhaustion. It was a calculated and temporary ceasefire dictated by pure, unadulterated realpolitik. The Carthaginian general Hamilcar, despite having a powerful army besieging Syracuse itself, was facing his own nightmare. A devastating plague was ripping through his camp, decimating his forces and shattering morale. Both leaders found themselves in a precarious position. Dionysius needed to buy time to crush his internal enemies and fortify his city without Carthaginian interference. Hamilcar needed a face-saving way to extract his dying army and return home without appearing to have suffered a total defeat. Their agreement was a classic product of such mutual desperation. The terms carved up Sicily into spheres of influence. Carthage retained control of its key western strongholds and the important native Sicilian cities that had allied with it. Dionysius was recognized as the ruler of Syracuse and granted dominion over a handful of other significant Greek cities in the southeast. Most humiliatingly for the Greek cause, the great city of Selinus, which had been brutally sacked by the Carthaginians just years earlier, was formally abandoned to its fate, left under Punic control. On the surface, it was a victory for Carthage, locking in their territorial gains. But Dionysius had secured the only thing that truly mattered to him at that moment: recognition of his authority and a free hand to do as he pleased within his own domain. For the new tyrant, this treaty was never a foundation for lasting peace. It was a strategic pause, a deliberate and deceptive gambit. He used the breathing space it provided with ruthless efficiency. He transformed Syracuse into the most heavily fortified city in the Greek world, constructing massive walls and a sprawling citadel on the island of Ortygia. He initiated a frantic arms build-up, constructing a vast fleet of new warships and innovating new siege engines and artillery. He systematically purged his political opponents and consolidated all levers of power into his own hands. Every single action was a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the peace with Carthage, which was surely intended to create a stable balance of power, not enable one signatory to prepare for a war of conquest. Dionysius was not hiding his intentions. He was using the treaty as a shield behind which he could openly sharpen his swords. Within a mere 4 years, the tyrant decided his preparations were complete. The pretext for war was as flimsy as it was predictable: a minor dispute over the status of some native Sicilian communities in the gray zone between the two spheres of influence. The accord was not formally renounced with a grand declaration. It was simply pushed aside, rendered irrelevant by Dionysius's overwhelming ambition and his newfound military might. He launched a full-scale offensive, not to reclaim lost Greek territory, but to drive the Carthaginians entirely off the island of Sicily. The conflict that followed was long and incredibly brutal, a series of wars that stretched over decades, but it firmly established the pattern Dionysius had invented. For the rest of his long reign, his foreign policy operated on a cynical cycle. When he needed time to recover from a defeat or prepare for a new adventure, he would negotiate a peace with Carthage. The moment he felt strong enough, he would break it, using the periods of truce to build the forces needed to shatter it. The original Pact of 405 did not fade away due to external pressures or the passage of time. It was deliberately and repeatedly murdered by the man who made it, then resurrected in different forms only to be betrayed again. Its quiet demise was not a whisper of neglect, but the silent, calculated click of a weapon being reloaded. Yet, even as the Roman Republic gasped its last breaths, torn apart by decades of civil war, a final, fleeting moment of hope flickered over the waters of the Bay of Naples. The year was 39 before the Common Era, and the Mediterranean world was effectively divided among three powerful warlords, each controlling a piece of the shattered Roman state. There was Octavian, the cunning and ruthless adopted son of Julius Caesar, who held Italy and the West. There was Mark Antony, the charismatic general and Caesar's former right-hand man, who commanded the wealthy eastern provinces. And then there was Sextus Pompeius, known as Pompey the Younger, the son of Caesar's great rival. Sextus did not control legions on land. His power was based entirely at sea. From his base in Sicily, he had built a formidable fleet, crewed by escaped slaves, disaffected republicans, and anyone else with a grievance against the ruling triumvirs. With this navy, he had become the master of the Mediterranean, enacting a brutal blockade that choked Italy's vital grain supply, bringing the heart of the Republic to the brink of famine and stirring dangerous unrest among a population weary of war and hunger. The pressure on Octavian, in particular, became unbearable. Riots erupted in Rome, with mobs throwing stones at his statues and blaming him for the empty granaries and soaring food prices. Something had to be done, and so the three rivals, each for their own desperate reasons, agreed to meet at the picturesque port of Misenum, a summit overshadowed not by trust but by mutual necessity. The negotiations were a surreal spectacle. They did not meet on land, where one might fear an ambush, but on a lavish platform built over the water, bridging the prows of two of Sextus's warships. This physical setting was a perfect metaphor for the agreement itself, a shaky, temporary structure floating on a sea of deep suspicion. Sextus, playing the role of the gracious host and now the indispensable power broker, is said to have entertained his rivals with a magnificent feast, the tension at the table palpable beneath the forced civility. The pact they signed, the Agreement of Misenum, was a masterpiece of political expediency. In exchange for lifting the devastating grain blockade and ending his naval raids, Sextus Pompey was offered a legitimacy he had always craved. He was granted official, formal governorship of Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and even the Peloponnese in Greece, a respectable domain for any Roman statesman. Most symbolically important, he was promised a future consulship and was included in the prestigious College of Augurs, signs that he was being welcomed back into the very Roman aristocratic fold from which he had been exiled. In return, he agreed to stop accepting runaway slaves into his fleet and to guarantee the grain supply to Rome. For the millions of ordinary Romans suffering from hunger, this was the only clause that mattered. The news that the blockade was over was met with jubilation in the streets. Statues were garlanded with flowers, and for a brief, shining moment, it seemed that peace had finally been achieved. The three men celebrated together, toasting their newfound accord as if the years of bitter warfare had been washed away, but the celebration was a mirage. The Agreement of Misenum was not a peace treaty. It was a tripartite surrender to temporary weakness. Octavian and Antony had not made a deal with Sextus because they respected him or desired his partnership. They did it because they needed to solve the immediate crisis of the grain shortage to stabilize their own rule and free their hands to deal with other threats. For them, recognizing the upstart son of Pompey was a distasteful but necessary humiliation, a strategic pause. Sextus, for his part, may have genuinely desired the legitimacy and honors bestowed upon him, but he fatally misread his opponents. He believed that the old rules of Roman politics still applied, that a grant of provinces and a promise of a consulship were binding and permanent. He failed to understand that he was dealing with men who were in the process of destroying the old republic and writing a new set of rules based solely on raw power. The betrayal was as swift as it was inevitable. Within a year, the fragile peace shattered. The specific pretexts were petty and almost certainly manufactured. accusations that Sextus was still Chinese letter harboring fugitives and that he was delaying grain shipments. The truth was that Octavian and Antony had used the breathing space provided by the agreement to consolidate their power, and now felt strong enough to eliminate the last loose end. The promises of Misenum were unceremoniously discarded. Octavian, with his agile lieutenant Marcus Agrippa, began a massive shipbuilding program, constructing a new, modern fleet that could challenge Sextus's dominance at sea. The final showdown came at the Battle of Nolochus in 36 BCE, where Agrippa's tactical genius and superior technology obliterated Sextus's navy. The master of the Mediterranean became a fugitive fleeing east, where he would shortly be captured and executed on Antony's orders. The man who had been promised a consulship died without a title, his realm dismantled, his memory scorned. The agreement of Misenum vanished from history so completely that it feels less like a failed treaty and more like a fleeting dream of peace, a whisper of reconciliation drowned out by the triumphant march of an empire being born from betrayal. Imagine a line drawn in the sand, a fragile barrier of ink and parchment meant to bring order to a world teetering on the edge of chaos. This was the essence of the Treaty of Dura Europos, an agreement forged around 160 before the Common Era between two empires locked in a slow, grinding dance of decline. On one side stood the Seleucid Empire, the crumbling remnant of Alexander the Great's Asian dominion, its authority fraying at the edges as rebellious satraps and ambitious local kings chipped away at its territory. On the other side was the rising Parthian Empire, a dynamic power born from the steppes that had swiftly conquered the Iranian plateau and now hungered for more. The treaty was a desperate attempt to freeze a moment in time, to establish a clear and mutually recognized border along the great Euphrates River, with the strategically vital fortress city of Dura Europos serving as a key point in this new frontier. For the Seleucids, it was a necessary concession, a chance to secure their vulnerable eastern flank against the Parthian onslaught, so they could focus on the endless civil wars and dynastic squabbles that were consuming them from within. For the Parthians, it was a moment of formal recognition, a treaty that legitimized their gains and gave them the breathing room to consolidate their stunningly rapid conquests. In the dusty chambers where the envoys met, it must have felt like a monumental achievement, a rare moment of clarity and stability in a region sliding into disorder. But the true power in history often lies not with the empires who write the treaties, but with the unpredictable forces that operate entirely outside the world of diplomacy. Even as the Seleucid and Parthian scribes carefully recorded the terms of their new border agreement, a distant storm was gathering on the eastern horizon, a force of nature that would make their careful calculations utterly irrelevant. From the vast, unexplored steppes of Central Asia, a new wave of nomadic confederations began to surge westward. These were not organized armies with supply lines and siege engines, but vast, mobile populations on the move, tribes like the Sokas and the Uegi, driven from their own homelands by conflict or climate, seeking new territories to settle. They moved with a relentless, decentralized pressure, like a flood finding every crack in a dam. Their arrival unleashed a domino effect of displacement and violence, pushing other tribes ahead of them, creating a tidal wave of human movement that crashed directly into the settled civilizations of the Middle East. The Parthian Empire, despite its recent rise, found itself directly in the path of this onslaught. Their eastern provinces were overrun, their cities sacked, and their king, Fawkes II, was killed in battle against the nomadic invaders. The entire eastern half of their empire was thrown into complete chaos, forcing them to abandon any interest in their western border with the Seleucids and throw every available resource into a desperate fight for their own survival. The treaty, so recently signed, was instantly forgotten. The border along the Euphrates became a meaningless line on a map that no one had the time or capacity to enforce. The Parthians were fighting for their very existence, and the meticulous terms agreed upon at Dura Europos were the furthest thing from their minds. At the very same moment, the Seleucid Empire was suffering its own final collapse. Riven by internal pretenders to the throne, and having lost its most valuable eastern territories to the Parthians even before the treaty, the kingdom was a hollow shell. The nomadic invasions only accelerated its disintegration, disrupting trade routes, sowing panic, and further weakening its already feeble central authority. Within a few short years of the treaty's signing, the Seleucid state ceased to function as a unified empire, fracturing into a handful of squabbling city-states and petty principalities in Syria. There was no longer a Seleucid emperor to uphold the agreement, no army to patrol the border, no treasury to pay for its maintenance. The entity that had signed the treaty simply ceased to exist. And so, the Treaty of Dura Europos did not end with a formal annulment or a new war between the signatories. It met a far quieter and more final fate. It was erased. The parchment it was written on was likely lost, reused, or simply crumbled to dust in some forgotten archive. The border it established became a ghost, a memory without a reality. The great fortress city of Dura Europos itself would later be conquered and occupied by the Parthians, then later by the Romans, its original purpose as a linchpin in a defunct treaty completely forgotten by its new inhabitants. The Pact's disappearance was so total, so silent, that its very existence has to be pieced together by archaeologists and historians from fragmentary clues. Its story is a humbling reminder of the fragility of human plans in the face of vast, impersonal historical forces. Two empires sat down to divide the world between them, only to have the world itself, in the form of thousands of nameless horsemen from the steppes, quietly sweep their agreement into the dustbin of history. In the rugged highlands east of Rome, a different kind of conflict was reaching its end, not with a decisive battle, but with a surprising and seemingly respectful handshake. The year was 304 before the Common Era, and the Equi people, a fierce Italic tribe, had been a thorn in Rome's side for generations. Their mountain strongholds had been the stage for decades of brutal raids and counter-raids, a grinding war of attrition that had drained both sides. Yet, when the final peace was negotiated, it was not the typical agreement of a victor dictating terms to a vanquished foe. Instead, the Fodesekwam was signed, a rare and remarkable equal treaty. This was not a Fodes iniquam, the standard, unequal treaty Rome imposed on defeated enemies that obligated them to provide soldiers and submit to Roman foreign policy. The Fodesekwam formally recognized the Equi as sovereign allies, socii, with rights and status theoretically equal to those of Rome itself. It was a pact between peers, a mutual defense alliance where both parties pledged to come to each other's aid and share the spoils of any joint campaign. For the war-weary Equi, it must have felt like a triumph, a hard-won recognition of their strength and independence that would allow their culture and way of life to continue, secure behind the formidable barrier of a solemn Roman oath. But the true genius of Roman expansion often lay not in the initial conquest, but in the patient, systematic, and often silent processes that followed it. The treaty itself was a masterpiece of political theater, creating an illusion of equality that masked the overwhelming reality of Roman power and ambition. While the Equi returned to their hills believing their sovereignty was now guaranteed by sacred law, Rome immediately began a campaign of quiet, relentless absorption. The first and most powerful tool was demographic imperialism. The Roman state began actively encouraging, and often directly funding the settlement of its own citizens on choice tracts of land within the territory formerly recognized as belonging to the Equi. These were not random squatters, they were strategic colonies, fortified towns populated by retired Roman legionaries and their families. These veterans were loyal to Rome, economically self-sufficient, and militarily proficient. Their very presence began to shift the cultural and economic gravity of the region. They built Roman-style farms, traded using Roman currency, and established local governments that reported directly back to the Senate. The Equi, who were predominantly pastoralists and lived in smaller, scattered settlements, suddenly found their homeland filling up with organized, confident, and unassailably Roman communities. Alongside this physical colonization came a more subtle form of erosion, legal and economic integration. Roman law, with its sophisticated concepts of property rights and contract enforcement, began to seep into the region. Equi nobles and merchants found that to engage in meaningful trade with the new colonies or with Rome itself, they had to operate within the Roman legal framework. This often meant seeking judgments from Roman magistrates or having their disputes adjudicated under Roman law, a process that gradually undermined their own traditional legal systems and authority structures. Economic dependency followed legal dependency. The new Roman colonies created markets for goods, but they also began to dominate local trade networks. Equi farmers and artisans found themselves increasingly tied to a Roman-controlled economy, where prosperity was linked to adopting Roman ways and catering to Roman tastes. The allure of Roman citizenship itself became a powerful magnet. Ambitious Equi leaders might be granted limited citizenship rights as a reward for cooperation, a privilege that created a powerful pro-Roman faction within the Equi elite itself, dividing their loyalties and co-opting their leadership. Over the course of a generation, the substance of the Fodesekwam was hollowed out from within. The Equi were not conquered by legions, they were enveloped by a civilization. Their territory did not change hands through war, but through the slow, inexorable processes of land purchase, intermarriage, and cultural assimilation. Their young men began to leave their mountain villages to seek opportunity in the Roman colonies or even in the city of Rome itself, further draining the tribe of its vitality and future. The mutual defense clause of the treaty became a cruel joke who were the Equi to defend themselves against. The ally that now lived among them owned their land and employed their people. There was no single moment when the treaty was declared null and void. It simply ceased to have any practical meaning. The Equi as a distinct, politically independent people faded away, their identity dissolved into the growing pool of Roman Italy. They gained the Roman citizenship they had never fought for, but in the process they lost everything that had made them Equi. The Fodesekwam, that rare pact of equals, did not break. It evaporated, leaving behind only a whisper of a people who had believed a piece of parchment could protect them from the relentless, patient, and utterly transformative tide of Rome. Yet even as Rome was quietly digesting its Italian allies through pacts like the Fodesekwam, a storm of rebellion was brewing at the very edge of its empire, one that would give birth to one of the most audacious and improbable long-distance alliances in ancient history. The year is 75 before the Common Era, and the Roman Republic is showing deep structural cracks. In the wealthy eastern provinces of Asia Minor, King Mithridates VI of Pontus is preparing for his third massive war against Rome, a personal crusade born from a burning hatred of Roman corruption and a fierce desire to carve out his own Eastern Empire. At the exact same moment, on the opposite side of the Mediterranean in Spain, a very different kind of rebel is waging his own war against the Roman Senate. This is Quintus Sertorius, a brilliant and charismatic Roman general who found himself on the losing side of a civil war. A committed populist and supporter of the reforms of Marius, Sertorius was forced to flee for his life when his faction was purged by the dictator Sulla. Rather than surrender or fade into obscurity, he did something astonishing. He escaped to the Iberian Peninsula and raised the standard of rebellion not as a foreign invader, but as a rival Roman government in exile. Sertorius's campaign in Spain was a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare and political persuasion. He didn't just lead an army of fellow Roman exiles. He managed to unite the fierce, independent-minded native Iberian tribes under his banner, something no Roman commander had ever achieved. He earned their loyalty not through force but through respect, adopting their customs and even forming a bodyguard of local warriors. He established a shadow senate in the city of Osca, complete with toga-clad senators, creating a mirror image of the Roman government that he claimed was the true, legitimate republic. His skill was so formidable that he repeatedly humiliated every general the Senate in Rome sent against him, making him a persistent and embarrassing thorn in the side of the powerful Sullan regime. Meanwhile, Mithridates, watching from the east, saw this rebellion not as a distant sideshow, but as a potential godsend. He realized that Sertorius, by tying down legions and resources in the west, could be the perfect distraction, forcing Rome to fight a devastating two-front war that could stretch its resources to the breaking point. The pact they forged was a breathtaking piece of strategic imagination, a plan to strangle the Roman Republic from both ends of the earth. Negotiations were conducted in secret, with envoys making the perilous journey by sea and land between the Spanish port of Dianium and the Pontic court. The terms were bold and specific. Sertorius, from his Spanish base, would receive from Mithridates a substantial infusion of gold and silver, as well as 40 warships to challenge Roman control of the Western Mediterranean. This would allow him to intensify his rebellion, potentially even threatening Italy itself. In return, Sertorius, acting with the authority of his own Senate, made an astonishing concession. He formally recognized Mithridates' sovereignty over the entire Roman province of Asia, all of it. This was the very territory Rome had spent blood and treasure to secure, and Sertorius was promising to hand it over to Rome's greatest enemy. For Mithridates, it was a diplomatic coup of unimaginable proportions, granting him the legitimacy he craved without firing a shot. For Sertorius, it was a pragmatic gamble, trading a territory he didn't control for the immediate resources he desperately needed to survive. It was a classic deal between two players who were betting everything on a future that would make their promises viable. The entire magnificent, world-altering scheme, however, was built on a foundation of pure personality. There was no institutional framework backing this agreement, no deep-seated national interests or long-standing alliances. Its entire lifeblood was the unique combination of Sertorius's military genius and Mithridates' boundless ambition. The Iberian tribes fought for Sertorius himself, not for the idea of a Roman republic in exile. The Pontic court followed Mithridates' daring vision. The pact was a wire stretched taut between these two towering individuals, and the moment that wire was cut, the entire structure collapsed into nothingness. The cut came not from a Roman legion, but from a traitor's knife at a banquet. Sertorius's success had bred jealousy among his own Roman lieutenants, men who felt overshadowed and saw greater opportunity in betraying their leader to the Sullan regime. A conspiracy was formed, led by a man named Marcus Perpenna Veiento. He invited Sertorius to a feast, and there, in the midst of the revelry, the great rebel was assassinated. His death was not just the loss of a general, it was the extinguishing of the very idea he represented. The aftermath was as swift as it was total. Perpenna, who foolishly believed he could simply step into Sertorius's shoes, was immediately outmatched. He lacked the tactical brilliance and, more importantly, the deep respect and loyalty Sertorius had cultivated with the Iberian tribes. The native allies, feeling betrayed and leaderless, melted away from the cause. The rival Roman government in exile instantly lost all credibility. Within a matter of months, the legendary Sertorian resistance, which had held off Rome for nearly a decade, simply disintegrated. The news of Sertorius's death traveled east, and with it died the treaty. Mithridates received the ships and gold he had sent for Sertorius's use returned to him, now useless. The promise of Asian sovereignty vanished like smoke. There was no one left in Spain to honor the agreement, no legitimate authority to uphold the bargain. The pact did not end with a formal annulment or a declaration of war. It just ceased to be mentioned, its purpose extinguished along with the life of the one man who could have made it a reality. Its silent, sudden end is the ultimate testament to a profound truth of history, that the grandest diplomatic designs, the most far-reaching strategies, can sometimes be utterly dependent on the fate of a single, irreplaceable individual. The sudden vacuum of power left by Alexander the Great's death was a chasm so vast and terrifying that even his most ambitious generals felt a momentary urge to step back from the brink. In the sweltering heat of Babylon in 311 before the Common Era, these men, the Diadochi, or successors, gathered not as comrades, but as rivals circling a colossal inheritance with no clear heir. The empire stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River, an impossibly vast tapestry of cultures, armies, and treasures, and every one of them believed they were the one destined to hold it all together. The Treaty of Babylon was their first, frantic attempt to impose order on the chaos, to draw lines on a map and assign satrapies as if they were dividing spoils after a hunt rather than trying to govern a world. Ptolemy took Egypt, a rich and defensible kingdom. Seleucus received Babylon and the eastern satrapies. Antigonus, the one-eyed, already the most powerful of them all, was granted overlordship of Asia Minor and Syria. Lysimachus got Thrace, and Cassander was recognized as the ruler of Macedon and Greece. On the surface, it was a comprehensive and logical division, a blueprint for a new world order where these titans could rule their respective domains in a fragile, parallel harmony. But this careful cartography was a fantasy, a desperate fiction that everyone signed and no one believed. The treaty's most fatal flaw was that it was not a peace agreement. It was a ceasefire document written by men who were already planning their next campaigns. It did not resolve the fundamental question that had haunted them since Alexander drew his last breath: who was truly in charge? The pact paid lip service to the idea of a unified empire by maintaining the fiction of joint rule by Alexander's mentally disabled half-brother, Philip III, and his infant son, Alexander IV. But these were mere puppets, pawns to be controlled and eventually eliminated by the general who held them. The treaty did not create a governing council or a mechanism for resolving disputes. It was a simple property settlement, and in the brutal, zero-sum game the Diadochi were playing, one man's gain was inherently another man's loss. The ink had not even dried on the parchment before each signatory began scrutinizing the terms, not for how they could build peace, but for how they could be exploited for advantage. The first and most obvious trigger for the treaty's immediate collapse was the sheer, overwhelming ambition of Antigonus the One-Eyed. From his power base in Asia Minor, he looked at the division not as the final word, but as the opening move. He saw himself not as the satrap of Syria, but as the rightful heir to Alexander's entire legacy. His territory placed him at the strategic center of the empire, and he immediately began acting with the authority of a supreme commander, interfering in the affairs of the other successors and demanding obedience. He expelled Seleucus from Babylon, a blatant act of aggression that shattered the core premise of the agreement. This was not a minor border skirmish. It was one of the treaty's principal signatories unilaterally dismantling the territory of another. Antigonus wasn't breaking the treaty, he was demonstrating its utter irrelevance through the only language he respected, raw force. Yet to blame the failure solely on Antigonus is to miss the deeper, more universal truth the Treaty of Babylon reveals. Every single one of the successors was guilty of the same ambition. Antigonus was simply the most powerful and impatient. Ptolemy in Egypt, for all his later reputation as a wise statesman, had already set himself on an independent course, quietly building his own fleet and cultivating his own power base without regard for the collective good. Cassander in Macedon held the royal family hostage, and his grip on power depended on preventing any other general from claiming the mantle of regent. The treaty did not calm their ambitions, it simply gave them a momentary geographical framework within which to pursue those ambitions more effectively. They used the brief respite provided by the agreement not to build a lasting peace, but to consolidate their forces, secure their flanks, and prepare for the inevitable, all-out war they all knew was coming. The pact was a temporary armistice that everyone treated as a preparation period for further conflict. Within a matter of months, the carefully drawn lines of the Treaty of Babylon were erased by the movement of armies. The so-called Third War of the Diadochi erupted, a complex and shifting series of alliances and betrayals that saw Ptolemy, Cassander, and Lysimachus unite against the perceived threat of Antigonus. The agreement was not formally renounced, it was simply swallowed by events. It became a historical footnote, a forgotten prelude to 2 decades of incessant warfare that would ultimately shatter Alexander's empire into the 3 great Hellenistic kingdoms of the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and the Antigonids. The Treaty of Babylon's failure was so absolute and so swift that it feels less like a diplomatic effort and more like a momentary pause for breath in the middle of a marathon brawl. Its legacy is the ultimate lesson in the limits of diplomacy when it confronts unbounded personal ambition. It proved that a map cannot hold back a tide, and that no amount of eloquent phrasing on parchment can contain the will of men who have looked upon the world and decided it must be theirs. Sometimes the most telling diplomatic failures are the ones that never even happen, the moments when history holds its breath, waiting for a negotiation that is doomed from the start. This is the strange and silent story of the Armistice of Trasamine, a peace that wasn't, a treaty that never was. In the spring of 217 before the Common Era, the Roman Republic was in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general they had so gravely underestimated, had just executed one of the most devastating military ambushes in all of ancient history. He had lured the entire Roman army of Consul Gaius Flaminius into a narrow defile along the shores of Lake Trasamine. In the thick morning fog, his forces descended from the hills, and in the brutal, close-quarters combat that followed, the Roman legions were annihilated. 15,000 Roman soldiers were killed, including the consul himself, whose body was never recovered. Another 15,000 were captured. In a single morning, a significant portion of Rome's available military strength had been wiped from the map, and the road to Rome itself now lay practically undefended. The shockwaves from this catastrophe reverberated through the city with the force of an earthquake. For the first time since the Gauls had sacked the city centuries earlier, a genuine, palpable terror gripped the populace. The Senate, the very heart of Roman governance, was thrown into disarray. The normal, stoic confidence of the Roman elite was replaced by a frantic scramble for survival. They appointed a veteran commander, Quintus Fabius Maximus, as dictator with absolute power, a move reserved for the most extreme emergencies. His first act was not to raise a new army, but to perform every religious ritual possible to appease the gods, whom the Romans were convinced had abandoned them. The city gates were locked and the bridges over the Tiber were cut. Rome was preparing for a siege, fully expecting to see Hannibal's standards appearing on the horizon at any moment. In this atmosphere of existential dread, with the very survival of the Republic hanging in the balance, a window for negotiation briefly cracked open. It is here that we must step into the mind of Hannibal, a commander as brilliant in psychology as he was in tactics. He knew he had achieved a stunning victory, but he also understood the profound difference between defeating an army and conquering a nation. His force, though magnificent, was a long way from home, operating in hostile territory without a reliable supply line or the machinery for a prolonged siege of a city as formidable as Rome. A direct assault on the capital would be a bloody, risky gamble. His grand strategy had always been more nuanced, to shatter the Roman Confederation by demonstrating Roman weakness and offering himself as a liberator to Rome's Italian allies. The victory at Trasamine presented a perfect opportunity to achieve this through diplomacy. Why waste his army in a costly siege when he could potentially convince Rome to sue for peace? He likely calculated that the Romans, in their current state of shock and despair, might finally be willing to negotiate a settlement that would end the war on terms favorable to Carthage, perhaps the return of Sardinia and Sicily, and formal recognition of Carthaginian dominance in Spain. And so, in the tense days following the battle, feelers were almost certainly extended. While no detailed record of formal negotiations survives, ancient sources like the historian Livy suggest that the possibility of discussing terms was in the air. Hannibal, following the customs of war, would have expected the defeated party to send envoys. He may have even held off his advance, waiting for a delegation from the Senate to appear in his camp. He was giving Rome a chance to surrender, to acknowledge its defeat and enter into talks that could end the bloodshed. For a moment, the brutal logic of the ancient world suggested that a treaty was not just possible, but the most rational next step. Carthage had won a spectacular victory. Rome was on its knees. This was how things were done. But the Roman Republic, even in its darkest hour, proved to be made of sterner stuff than Hannibal had anticipated. The very terror that gripped the city also forged a spine of cold, defiant iron. The Roman Senate, after the initial panic subsided, made a momentous and defining decision. There would be no negotiation, there would be no envoys, there would be no discussion of terms. Surrender was not merely off the table, it was a concept that did not exist in their political vocabulary. Led by the resolve of the newly appointed dictator Fabius, the Senate chose a path of absolute, uncompromising resistance. They would never admit defeat. They would never treat with an enemy army on Italian soil. This was not a strategic calculation in the narrow sense. It was a matter of national identity, a raw declaration of character. To negotiate from a position of such weakness, they believed, would be a permanent stain on Roman honor, a signal to every other rival and subject tribe that Rome could be broken. They would rather risk total destruction than admit they were beaten. Consequently, the silence from Rome was deafening. No diplomats traveled to Hannibal's camp. No offers were made. The window for negotiation didn't just close, it was bricked up from the inside. The anticipated discussions simply never happened. The Armistice of Trasamine is not a forgotten treaty. It is a phantom treaty, a non-event whose significance lies entirely in its absence. It represents the road not taken, the conversation that died before a single word was spoken. Its failure was the quietest of all, not a whisper on the wind, but a void of silence. This non-agreement exemplifies a profound historical truth. Sometimes the most powerful diplomatic statement is a flat, stony refusal to even engage in diplomacy. It was a gamble of incredible risk, but one that ultimately defined the entire course of the war, convincing Hannibal that he was facing an enemy that could not be reasoned with, only broken, a task that would ultimately prove beyond even his magnificent abilities. So what can we truly learn from these 25 whispers of failed diplomacy? The lesson is not that treaties are useless, far from it. They are essential tools the best humanity has ever devised to step back from the brink of war. But their quiet, crumbling ends reveal a deeper truth. A treaty is not a finish line. It is not a magical incantation that, once signed, forever banishes the specter of conflict. Instead, these forgotten pacts show us that peace is a living, breathing process. It is a garden that requires constant tending, not a monument carved in stone that can withstand any storm. The moment a treaty is signed, the real work begins. It demands relentless vigilance from its signatories, a willingness to adapt to shifting power dynamics, and above all, a foundation of genuine mutual interest that runs deeper than mere convenience. Without these things, even the most celebrated agreement is just words waiting to be undone by the relentless tide of human ambition, fear, and the simple, unpredictable passage of time. Think about the world we live in today, with its own complex web of alliances and trade pacts and nuclear non-proliferation agreements. They feel permanent, solid, immovable features on our geopolitical landscape. But so too did the pact between Rome and Carthage, or the personal bond between Alexander and Porus. The forces that silently unraveled those ancient vows are still very much with us. The same human nature that led a Spartan king to abandon an alliance the second it was no longer useful, or a kin strategist to view a treaty as a temporary feint, still operates in the halls of power today. The same shifting currents of economic power, technological disruption, and internal political strife that fractured the Seleucid Empire and made the Treaty of Apemia irrelevant can still reshape our modern world in the blink of an eye. The next time you hear news of a grand, world-altering agreement, remember the lessons of these whispers from the past. Listen closely to the language used, observe the body language of the leaders at the table, and consider the true balance of power and interest beneath the surface. You might just hear the faint, almost imperceptible sound of its eventual end, a quiet reminder that in diplomacy, as in life, nothing is ever truly set in stone. If this journey through the echoes of failed diplomacy has captivated you, showing how easily promises between empires can dissolve into whispers, then your next click is an easy one. Liking this video is the simplest way to let us know you want more content just like it, diving into the shadows of history to bring forgotten stories back into the light. Subscribing to our channel is your ticket to this ongoing adventure. It's your personal invitation to join our community of curious minds every time we uncover another piece of the past. And for those who never want to miss a discovery, tapping that bell icon is absolutely essential. It turns on notifications so you're always the first to know when we've published our next investigation into history's greatest mysteries. We are genuinely eager to hear which of these 25 treaties resonated most deeply with you. Does the personal pact between Alexander and Porus, which died with the men who made it, feel like a cautionary tale for today's world of charismatic leaders? Or does the cold, cynical betrayal of the Kin-Chu alliance strike you as the ultimate example of realpolitik, a lesson that never seems to grow old? Scroll down and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which agreement you believe holds the most powerful lesson for modern diplomats and world leaders. That conversation, sparked by your insights and perspectives, is what makes this channel so special. Your engagement does far more than just support our channel. It actively helps us decide which hidden stories to pursue next. Every like, every subscription, and every comment you leave sends us a signal, guiding our research and helping us allocate resources to dig even deeper into the archives of history. You are not just a viewer, you are a collaborator in this grand project of unearthing the past. From the entire team here, a sincere thank you for your time and your curiosity. We can't wait to share what we uncover next with you. Thanks for